The rain has been falling for so many hours that the ground no longer receives it. Water rests on the surface instead, trembling faintly whenever another pair of boots crosses the camp road. The mud has become smooth in places where too many men have walked the same path between the tents and the kitchens, between the kitchens and the long wooden tables where names are copied into ledgers no one fully trusts anymore. Somewhere beyond the fog, an engine starts and then dies again. Nobody turns toward the sound. Engines have been starting and dying for weeks. Canvas walls move softly in the wind. Not enough to flap. Only enough to remind the men inside that the weather still exists beyond the smell of wet wool and coal smoke. A lantern hangs from a pole near the center of the camp, its light yellow and unsteady, barely strong enough to survive the mist surrounding it. Underneath that light, a corporal continues stamping papers long after midnight, his fingers stained blue with ink that refuses to dry in the cold air. Beside him sits a stack of transport orders already crossed out and replaced by newer ones. Entire train routes have disappeared overnight. Borders have shifted faster than the maps can be redrawn. The war, they say, is over. Yet the camp continues breathing exactly as it did before the announcement arrived. You watch the road leading north disappear into darkness, its edges softened by rain and exhaustion alike. Trucks stand parked along the ditch with their tires half buried in mud. Some still carry crates tied beneath damp tarpaulins. Others hold nothing at all. Drivers sleep upright behind fogged glass, boots resting on pedals that no longer lead toward any front. A few soldiers move carefully between the vehicles carrying buckets of water or bundles of firewood gathered from ruined fences nearby. Their movements are slow, practiced, almost absent-minded. The body continues routines long after certainty leaves it. Beyond the trucks, rows of temporary shelters stretch across the hillside in uneven lines. Some were meant for 3 nights. Some for a week. The oldest among them have now survived 2 seasons. Their canvas roofs sag beneath pooled rainwater. Their ropes have been retied so many times that knots hang in clusters like swollen fingers. Men inside these shelters still speak about departure as if it were close enough to touch. Tomorrow, perhaps. Next week. Once the rail lines reopen. Once headquarters clarifies the situation. Once the papers arrive from the south. Once the Americans release more fuel. Once the river crossings are repaired. Always once. Never now. A soldier sits alone outside one of the tents with a mess tin balanced between his hands. Steam rises from the soup in thin pale ribbons before vanishing into the damp air. He does not eat immediately. Instead he stares toward the distant hills where artillery once flashed every evening without fail. The silence there now feels stranger than the shelling ever did. During the war, sound at least confirmed direction. Men knew where danger lived. They understood movement. Advance. Retreat. Hold position. Cross here. Wait there. Even fear possessed shape then. Now the silence spreads in every direction equally. The camp exists inside that silence like driftwood left behind after a flood. Somewhere farther down the hill, 2 mechanics continue repairing an engine beneath hanging lamps powered by a generator that coughs every few minutes. They work carefully despite having nowhere meaningful to drive once the repairs are finished. One wipes grease across his sleeve. The other turns a wrench slowly while listening to distant voices carried by the wind. Their habits remain military in precision. Their purpose does not. This is how endings sometimes arrive. Not through triumph. Not through ceremony. But through extension. Through delays that lengthen quietly until men begin measuring time differently without realizing they have done so. Inside the registration tent, another line forms near dawn. Wet coats drip onto wooden floors already darkened by mud. Clerks ask for names, units, destinations, papers. Some soldiers still carry documents stamped by governments that no longer fully exist. Others present orders signed by officers already dead. One man unfolds a train schedule from his pocket, though the rail station it references was destroyed months ago. Nobody tells him to throw it away. The paper itself has become part of the waiting. Outside, the rain continues with patient consistency. Water gathers beneath the wheels of parked artillery pieces whose barrels now point nowhere at all. Crows settle along the fence posts beyond the camp perimeter, black shapes against the pale morning mist. The guards still rotate shifts at the entrance despite almost nobody attempting to leave. There are checkpoints farther down the roads now. Different uniforms. Different flags. Different permissions required for movement across territories that changed ownership faster than the soldiers stranded inside them could understand. The army remains intact physically. That is the strange part. The kitchens still serve meals. Roll calls still occur. Boots are still polished when polish can be found. Weapons are cleaned. Trucks repaired. Reports filed. Yet beneath these routines something invisible has already begun loosening. The war carried the army forward even while destroying it. Peace has stopped it in place. And still no one knows when they are going home. For now, stay here a little longer in the rain and silence before the road continues deeper into the waiting. And if these quiet journeys through history help you rest or reflect, take a moment to subscribe, but only if you feel the campfires, distant engines, and forgotten roads of echoes of war are worth returning to again. Morning arrives slowly through the fog, less like light and more like the gradual thinning of darkness. The camp emerges piece by piece. First the fence posts. Then the trucks. Then the thin trails of smoke rising from cook fires dampened by rainwater during the night. Somewhere a bell rings twice, hollow and metallic, calling men toward another breakfast that tastes almost identical to the one before it. Bread hardened by cold air. Thin coffee stretched too far with boiled water. Soup carried over from yesterday's kettles. The army still feeds itself because feeding itself is one of the last proofs that it remains an army at all. Men gather quietly around the field kitchens, holding dented tins beneath drifting steam. Few speak loudly anymore. The loudest voices belong to the early weeks after the ceasefire, when rumors still carried momentum. Back then, every arriving truck seemed capable of delivering orders that might finally dissolve the camp. Entire evenings disappeared into speculation. Ships waiting at southern ports. Rail convoys forming beyond the river. Negotiations between governments. New command structures. Emergency transfers. Demobilization schedules copied by hand and passed from tent to tent like sacred texts. Most of those papers vanished as quickly as they appeared. Now the rumors move more slowly. They arrive tired. You watch a young lieutenant pin a fresh notice onto a board already layered with older announcements curling at the edges from moisture. Several soldiers approach to read it without urgency. One lights a cigarette before stepping closer, as though preparing himself for disappointment in advance. The notice explains little. Reorganization. Delays. Verification procedures. Await further instruction. The language feels smooth from overuse, polished by repetition until meaning has worn thin beneath it. Beyond the kitchens, laundry lines sway between poles hammered into soft ground. Shirts hang beside military blankets darkened by moisture that never fully leaves the fabric anymore. Nearby, several men shave using fragments of mirror propped against ammunition crates. One carefully trims around a scar crossing his jaw while another splashes cold water onto his face from a metal basin already clouded with mud. The gestures are intimate in their persistence. Tiny acts of maintenance performed against a world that no longer provides clear direction. The camp doctor moves between shelters carrying a notebook swollen from rain. Influenza has begun spreading through the northern rows again. Nothing catastrophic. Just coughing. Fever. Fatigue that lingers longer than expected. Bodies exhausted not only by war, but by suspension afterward. Men recover more slowly when nothing awaits them beyond recovery. Even the doctor's footsteps seem quieter now as he passes through the lanes between tents, pausing occasionally to listen before lifting the canvas flap and stepping inside. Inside those shelters, time behaves strangely. Some men sleep through daylight because the nights refuse to pass. Others remain awake until dawn playing cards beneath weak lanterns, prolonging conversation simply to avoid listening to silence. Boots line the tent entrances in neat rows beside rifles wrapped carefully against moisture. Letters are folded and unfolded until their creases soften like cloth. Photographs pass from hand to hand so often that fingerprints have dulled entire faces into pale shadows. A sergeant sits near the rear of one tent repairing the strap of a satchel with thread pulled from an old blanket. He works slowly, methodically, despite the satchel containing almost nothing now. Across from him, another soldier writes the same date twice at the top of a letter before crossing both out. Somewhere beyond the canvas walls, rain taps gently against helmets left upside down near the entrance trench. Nobody hurries. There is nowhere urgent left to go. At the edge of the camp, a row of artillery pieces stands beneath camouflage netting already beginning to sag. Their crews continue maintenance routines each morning, oiling mechanisms and checking wheels that may never turn again. One soldier wipes rainwater carefully from a sighting instrument while staring toward distant woods wrapped in fog. During the war, those trees represented danger, enemy movement, hidden guns, ambush positions. Now they simply stand there, wet and unmoving, holding their silence without explanation. The hardest thing for many of the men is not fear. It is the absence of proportion. War gave each day weight. Even terrible days carried direction. Hunger meant movement would follow. Shellfire meant lines were shifting. Orders created momentum. But here, inside the waiting, hours spread outward without resistance. Small inconveniences become enormous because nothing larger interrupts them. A delayed meal. Missing boots. A rumor disproven by noon. Rainwater leaking through canvas onto blankets already damp from the night before. These things settle heavily when time no longer advances properly. The officers feel it too, though they hide it differently. Maps remain pinned inside headquarters tents with fresh markings added almost daily, but the front lines no longer matter the way they once did. Now the maps track rail access, refugee routes, occupied sectors, fuel reserves, political boundaries rewritten by distant negotiations. Captains argue quietly over paperwork instead of strategy. Majors spend evenings composing requests that disappear upward through chains of command already collapsing beneath reconstruction and exhaustion. Entire divisions wait for signatures from offices hundreds of miles away. And every morning the camp wakes again. Another line forms near the registration tables. Another convoy fails to arrive. Another rumor circles the tents before fading by evening. The repetition grows so complete that the men begin measuring life through tiny variations instead. A dry pair of socks. A letter delivered after weeks of silence. A cigarette traded successfully. A night without rain. Someone laughing unexpectedly beside the kitchens. These become events now. The war has ended loudly elsewhere. Cities celebrate beneath electric light. Flags rise over government buildings. Speeches echo through crowded squares. But here, in the soaked stillness between broken railways and uncertain borders, the ending arrives more slowly. It arrives through paperwork, through postponed transport, through camps meant to vanish that instead deepen roots into the mud. You stand at the edge of the encampment as evening lowers itself once more across the hillside. Lanterns begin appearing one by one through the mist, soft circles of amber floating inside the rain. Somewhere a harmonica plays briefly before stopping midway through the melody. The wind carries the smell of coal smoke, wet earth, boiled soup, and wool that has not fully dried in months. Beyond the fence, the road disappears again into darkness, and the army waits beside it. Roads that no longer advance. The road beside the camp was built for movement. That much remains visible even now beneath the layers of mud and standing water. Its width speaks of convoys once expected to pass without interruption. Its ditches were dug carefully to survive heavy transport. Broken mile markers still lean along the edges, their numbers faded beneath rain and smoke. During the war, engines rolled across this road day and night without pause. Fuel trucks, ambulances, artillery tractors dragging guns toward distant fronts. Men marched beside it carrying rifles darkened by weather and sweat. Orders moved faster then. Even retreat possessed direction. Now the road spends most of its time empty. Only occasionally does a truck appear from the southern hills, its tires grinding softly through the mud before disappearing again into the northern fog. Whenever engines approach, heads rise automatically across the camp. Men stop shaving, stop eating, stop cleaning weapons already cleaned twice that morning. Some step outside their tents before realizing they have done so. Hope has become reflexive here. The body reacts before the mind can protect itself from disappointment. A transport convoy finally arrives just after midday, though the word convoy hardly suits it anymore. Fuel shortages. Delays at checkpoints controlled by forces using different maps and different rules. One driver mentions a station where thousands of men have been sleeping inside freight depots waiting for transport that never arrives. Another says entire convoys have been redirected south without explanation. The stories drift through the camp within minutes, growing heavier each time they are repeated. You watch the officers listening carefully without interrupting. They no longer dismiss rumors the way they once did. Too many official reports now arrive already outdated by the time they are read aloud. Information has become weather here. Temporary, unstable, capable of changing direction before sunset. He presses the pencil harder each time the paper softens beneath his hand. Beside him sits another book containing the names of soldiers still awaiting transport authorization. The pages are dense with annotations. Delayed. Pending review. Reassigned temporarily. Awaiting confirmation. Some names have remained there so long that the ink itself has begun fading before the men are allowed to leave. The waiting transforms objects first. Boots lose shape from dampness. Uniform collars fray. Buttons disappear and are replaced by mismatched ones traded between units. Blankets absorb the permanent smell of smoke and wet earth. Even metal changes here. Rifles cleaned obsessively during combat now gather thin rust beneath their bolts despite daily maintenance. The moisture enters everything eventually. By afternoon the rain weakens into mist, revealing more of the countryside surrounding the encampment. The fields beyond the road lie flattened and colorless beneath low clouds. Abandoned farmhouses stand scattered across distant hillsides with roofs collapsed inward from shell damage or neglect. Fence lines disappear halfway across the landscape where retreating vehicles once cut directly through them. In certain places, the earth itself still carries long scars left by tracked machines months earlier. Grass has begun returning carefully around those wounds, though not evenly. The soldiers notice these things more now. During the war, landscapes were read tactically. A forest meant concealment. A hill meant visibility. Rivers meant obstacles or protection depending on direction of travel. But stranded armies begin seeing terrain differently. Men stare longer at ruined homes. They notice smoke rising from distant chimneys. They watch birds returning to fields where artillery once landed daily. The world slowly resumes civilian rhythms around them while they remain suspended outside those rhythms entirely. At dusk, several men gather beside the roadside to smoke beneath a torp stretched between two trucks. Their conversation drifts without urgency. One speaks about his wife cutting his hair on summer evenings before the war. Another describes a bakery near the river in his hometown where the windows fogged during winter mornings. A third says little at all, only rubbing dirt from the seam of his glove while listening to rainwater slide from the top overhead. None of them speak much about combat anymore. The memories arriving now are smaller. Civilian memories. Lamps inside kitchens. Bicycle tires over cobblestones. The sound of keys dropped onto a wooden table after work. These details surface because the men still believe return is approaching close enough to imagine physically. Home remains concrete in their minds. Reachable. Preserved somewhere beyond the damaged railways and occupied roads. That belief keeps the camp stable. For now. As darkness settles across the hills, headlights appear suddenly along the southern road once again. This time the reaction across the encampment is slower. Men glance upward but do not immediately rise. A few continue eating. Others remain seated outside their tents beneath blankets pulled around their shoulders against the cold. Hope still exists, though fatigue has begun forming around it like frost around glass. The approaching vehicle turns out not to be transport at all, but a staff car carrying 2 officers from regional command. The car stops near headquarters while soldiers watch from a distance through drifting mist. The officers emerge carrying folders wrapped carefully beneath oilcloth. One removes his gloves before entering the command tent. The other pauses briefly beside the vehicle, staring toward the crowded shelters stretching across the hillside. He looks at the camp the way men study structures that were never meant to become permanent. Nearby, the road continues northward into darkness, wet and shining faintly beneath the lantern light. It still resembles a road capable of departure. That illusion matters. The soldiers preserve it carefully each time they clear debris from the ditches or spread gravel across the worst sections of mud. Keeping the road usable feels important even when nobody knows who will eventually travel upon it. Because if the road dies completely, something larger may die with it. The officers remain inside headquarters long after the camp lanterns dim for the night. Their silhouettes move occasionally behind the canvas walls, blurred by weak yellow light and drifting rain. Outside the tent, 2 military policemen stand beneath soaked coats with their collars turned high against the cold wind moving down from the hills. They do not guard against attack anymore. They guard documents now. Fuel manifests. Personnel lists. Transfer requests. Orders rewritten so many times that entire paragraphs have become layered with corrections and new signatures pressed over old ones. A clerk exits briefly carrying a stack of papers held tightly beneath his arm. The pages ripple in the damp air before he disappears toward the communications shelter where radio operators continue listening to distant transmissions through static that thickens after midnight. Some frequencies still carry fragments of military traffic from territories where fighting has not fully stopped. Others transmit nothing at all except weather interference and the low electric hiss of abandoned channels. One operator keeps headphones pressed against his ears for nearly an hour without writing a single word. You watch him continue listening anyway. The habit itself has become part of survival. Near the center of the camp, generators pulse unevenly beside fuel drums covered with tarpaulins. The electricity they provide is weak but precious. A mechanic kneels beside one machine with a lantern balanced near his boots, tightening a valve while snow-like rain drifts through the beam of light. His hands move confidently despite exhaustion. He repaired engines near active fronts for almost 4 years. Back then, every repair carried immediate consequence. Men could die if machinery failed. Movement depended upon him. Now the generators mainly power lamps, radios, and the small heaters reserved for medical tents. Still, he repairs them with the same care. Many of the soldiers do. That is another strange feature of the waiting. Men continue behaving as though importance might suddenly return without warning. Uniforms are brushed. Rifles inspected. Boots polished whenever dry cloth can be found. Entire routines survive after the reason for them has faded. The army preserves itself instinctively, like a body continuing to breathe while asleep. Past midnight, the rain finally weakens enough for sound to travel farther across the valley. Somewhere beyond the hills, a train whistle rises faintly through the darkness. The effect on the camp is immediate though subtle. Heads lift inside shelters. Conversations pause. Markets returning. The words feel almost fictional here. One soldier asks whether civilians still line up for ration bread back home. Another wonders aloud if electric trams are running again in the capital. Their questions carry the tone of men discussing places damaged not only by war, but by distance itself. Memory begins shifting when separation lasts too long. Streets grow uncertain. Familiar buildings rearrange themselves in the mind. Entire neighborhoods become preserved at the exact moment the soldiers last saw them. Meanwhile, the real cities continue changing without permission from memory. Toward dawn, frost begins forming along the edges of puddles outside the tents. The temperature drops sharply after the rain passes, turning the camp quieter still. Boots crunch softly across frozen ground as sentries rotate positions near the entrance road. One guard pauses beside the fence line to watch mist gathering over the fields beyond. During the war, dawn usually brought expectation. Orders. Reconnaissance flights. Artillery checks. Engines starting. The beginning of another operation. Now dawn mainly confirms continuation. The camp has survived another night exactly as it survived the previous one. In the medical tent, a feverish soldier wakes briefly beneath heavy blankets while a nurse changes the cloth resting across his forehead. Nearby, another man coughs in his sleep without fully waking. Medicines arrive irregularly now. So do replacements for the exhausted staff trying to manage hundreds of men whose illnesses are shaped as much by waiting as by weather. Fatigue settles differently here. It moves inward. Sleep no longer restores the body properly because the mind remains suspended between departure and uncertainty. Outside, smoke rises again from the kitchens as morning fires are lit before sunrise. The cooks work silently beneath hanging lanterns, chopping hardened vegetables beside steaming kettles blackened by years of use. One of them pauses occasionally to rub warmth back into his hands before returning to the same repetitive motions. Nearby, horses tied beside supply wagons stamp against frozen mud while breath pours from their nostrils in pale clouds. The camp is already waking. Not eagerly. Simply because armies wake when morning arrives. You stand near the road as the sky slowly lightens beyond the hills, watching frost gleam faintly across abandoned tire tracks hardened overnight. The same road that once carried divisions toward battle now leads only toward uncertainty. Yet every morning the men look toward it anyway. They study approaching engines. Listen for distant rail whistles. Search for signs that movement may finally resume. Because the stranded condition has not yet fully entered them. Not completely. Somewhere deep beneath the exhaustion, many still believe this pause belongs to history rather than permanence. They believe the machinery of nations will eventually remember them waiting here beside the ruined roads. They believe papers will be stamped correctly. Fuel will arrive. Trains will come north again. Borders will stabilize long enough for passage. And so the camp continues preserving itself against evidence. One repaired engine at a time. One inventory sheet at a time. One dawn at a time beside a road that no longer advances. Temporary camps becoming permanent. The camp begins changing shape long before the soldiers admit it has changed at all. At first the differences seem practical. Trenches dug deeper against rainwater. Additional boards laid across the mud between tents. Canvas roofs reinforced with scavenged timber from nearby barns already damaged beyond repair. Men stop sleeping in boots every night. Cooking areas become more organized. Empty fuel crates are converted into stools, shelves, tables. Someone hangs a small mirror beside the entrance of one shelter using wire pulled from abandoned communications equipment. These are not the gestures of departure. They are the gestures of staying. Still, nobody speaks of permanence openly. The officers continue posting revised transport estimates every few days. Headquarters sends fresh instructions explaining delays caused by political negotiations, damaged infrastructure, shortages of fuel, uncertainty regarding borders. The language remains temporary in tone even when the waiting itself no longer feels temporary. Soldiers read these notices quietly before returning to their routines with increasingly practiced expressions of restraint. By now, most understand that disappointment spreads faster when spoken aloud. Morning inspections continue despite everything. A captain walks slowly between rows of shelters while men stand outside in uneven formation beneath pale skies carrying the smell of wet earth and smoke. Uniforms no longer match perfectly. Some coats belong to different divisions. Some boots come from entirely different armies. Yet collars are still adjusted before inspection. Buttons fastened carefully. Rifles held correctly despite rust appearing near the sights and bolts. The performance matters because the structure matters. Without structure, the waiting would become visible too quickly. You watch the captain pause beside one shelter where rainwater has collapsed part of the roof during the night. Several soldiers stand nearby repairing the damage with strips of canvas cut from an abandoned medical tent. Their movements are calm. Efficient. One climbs onto the frame while another passes up wooden planks salvaged from packing crates. Nobody complains openly anymore when tents fail. The camp has existed long enough for deterioration to become expected. Beyond the shelters, smoke drifts across the hillside from burn pits where damaged supplies are discarded each afternoon. Broken boots. Mold blankets. Cracked ammunition boxes swollen from moisture. The smell settles into everything. Clothing. Hair. Bread carried from the kitchens wrapped in cloth. Even letters mailed from the camp arrive carrying faint traces of smoke and damp canvas, according to those lucky enough to receive replies. Mail distribution has become one of the most delicate moments of the day. Shortly after noon, a truck arrives carrying sacks of letters tied with military cord. The reaction across the camp is immediate but restrained, like thirst concealed behind discipline. Men gather near the administration tables pretending casual interest while clerks begin sorting envelopes by unit and surname. Some soldiers receive thick bundles wrapped with string. Others receive nothing week after week while continuing to wait in line each time the mail arrives. One man unfolds a letter so carefully it seems fragile enough to break apart in his hands. Another stares at a photograph tucked inside an envelope for several long seconds before slipping it quietly into his breast pocket without speaking. Nearby, a soldier reads half a page before folding the letter again immediately, as though unable to continue. Nobody asks questions. Privacy has become sacred in the camp because personal news now carries disproportionate weight. A single sentence can alter an entire week here. The absence of letters alters even more. Inside the kitchens, the cooks have started planting herbs in empty ration tins placed along the warmer side of the supply tent. Parsley, onion shoots, thin green stems rising carefully through dark soil gathered from beyond the perimeter fence. One cook waters them each evening using leftover tea. The sight unsettles some of the men more than ruined villages ever did. Growing things imply duration. Roots imply expectation of remaining long enough to watch something mature. Yet the herbs continue growing. So does the camp. At the northern edge of the encampment, several engineers spend entire afternoons reinforcing drainage ditches before winter deepens further. They work methodically with shovels and picks while frost hardens the ground beneath their boots. During active combat, engineering crews built bridges meant to last days at most. Roads designed for immediate movement. That world now feels almost theoretical. Late that same night, snow begins falling for the first time. At first only lightly. Thin flakes dissolving against wet ground. Then gradually thicker, quieter, until the entire camp softens beneath white accumulation. Tents become rounded shapes beneath the snowfall. Tire tracks disappear. Supply crates turn pale beneath gathering frost. The road itself fades at the edges as snow fills the old ruts left by military convoys months earlier. Several soldiers step outside simply to watch. Snow changes the emotional weight of camps. Rain suggests delay. Snow suggests endurance. A medic standing near the kitchens pulls his coat tighter while observing flakes collect along the fence posts. Beside him, another man remarks quietly that they were supposed to be home before winter arrived. Nobody answers immediately because too many remember saying the same thing weeks earlier about autumn rains. The seasons are moving now, and the camp is moving with them. Snow remains through the morning. Not deep enough to stop movement, but sufficient to alter every sound inside the camp. Boots no longer strike mud with wet heaviness. Instead they compress frost with a muted crunch that drifts softly between the shelters before fading into the pale air. Smoke rises straighter now from the chimneys and burn barrels because the wind has weakened overnight. The entire hillside appears quieter beneath the thin white covering, as though the landscape itself has lowered its voice. The soldiers wake slowly to this new silence. Canvas roofs sag beneath gathered snow where rainwater once pooled. Men emerge from the shelters wrapped in blankets or heavy coats, breath clouding faintly around tired faces still marked by interrupted sleep. One soldier uses the handle of a shovel to strike ice from a frozen water barrel while another clears snow away from stacked fuel drums beside the generators. Nearby, A cook kneels outside the kitchen splitting damp firewood with careful, measured blows that echo lightly through the camp. Winter changes labor. Everything requires slightly more effort now. Once the southern rail junction reopens. Once the transfer papers are processed. Now the language becomes broader. Eventually. Sooner or later. When things stabilize. The future loses edges first. You watch this happen near the kitchens one afternoon while several men stand warming their hands beside a barrel fire assembled from broken furniture gathered in abandoned villages nearby. Their conversation drifts between memories of civilian work and speculation about reconstruction efforts beyond the occupied territories. One man wonders whether his old factory still exists. Another says his hometown likely belongs to a different government now. Nobody argues. The uncertainty surrounding home has become too large for argument. Word spreads quickly after he manages to restore movement to an officer's damaged pocket watch using salvaged springs from abandoned equipment. Soon men arrive carrying broken wristwatches wrapped carefully in cloth. Most stopped during the final months of fighting. Water damage. Shock from explosions. Lack of maintenance. The watch repairman works silently each evening beneath a lantern, tiny metal parts spread across an ammunition crate while the camp around him settles slowly into darkness. Many of the repaired watches lose time. Some gain it. Still, the soldiers wear them proudly afterward. The illusion of measured hours comforts people trapped inside unmeasured waiting. They sound less like victory and more like memory trying to preserve itself before fading entirely. You stand beyond the firelight watching the camp at night beneath falling snow. Lanterns glow dimly through layers of frost collecting along the shelter ropes. Smoke drifts low across the hillside. Somewhere an engine coughs briefly before falling silent again. The roads entering the camp remain technically open, yet fewer vehicles arrive each week now that winter has begun tightening across the region. And still the soldiers continue improving the camp. Additional insulation appears inside tents. Walkways are reinforced with salvaged timber. Supply caches are reorganized carefully against expected shortages. One guard pauses beside the northern road where snow has nearly erased the old tire tracks completely. He studies the empty distance for a long moment before adjusting his gloves against the cold. The road still leads home somewhere. That is what matters. Even if nobody can say anymore how long the journey will take. The shape of repetition. The mornings begin before light now. Winter has shortened the days enough that darkness still covers the camp when the kitchen crews rise from their blankets and step into the frozen air carrying buckets and split wood toward the cook fires. Frost whitens the ropes securing the tents. Ice forms along the edges of wash basins left uncovered overnight. Somewhere beyond the shelters, an axe strikes timber in slow measured intervals that echo across the sleeping hillside like the ticking of an enormous clock. The camp wakes gradually around these sounds. Not suddenly. Not energetically. Men emerge one by one into the blue darkness carrying mess tins or rubbing warmth back into stiff fingers while smoke drifts low across the frozen ground. Such details consume entire portions of the day now. Repetition expands to fill available time. After breakfast, lines form outside the administration tent where transfer requests are processed beneath hanging lanterns and the constant scratching of pencils across paper. Soldiers arrive carrying folders softened by moisture and age. Identity papers. Reassignment forms. Medical evaluations. Letters from civilian authorities requesting release or confirmation of survival. The clerks behind the tables work steadily from dawn until evening, stamping documents with practiced motions while steam rises from cups of weak coffee beside them. Most requests disappear upward into systems too distant for the camp to observe directly. Still, the lines return every day. A young private near the front unfolds the same letter repeatedly while waiting his turn. The paper has become thin along the creases. You can tell from the careful way he handles it that the contents have already been memorized entirely. Across from him, an older sergeant removes his gloves and studies a transport authorization stamped nearly 6 weeks earlier yet still considered incomplete due to revised territorial regulations farther north. Nobody expresses outrage anymore when delays occur. Outrage requires energy. The waiting has begun sanding sharp emotions smooth. Even frustration repeats predictably now. Outside the tent, snow melts slowly beneath hundreds of passing boots before freezing again after sunset into uneven ridges of ice. Men learn where to step safely through experience alone. Certain paths across the camp become permanent through repetition. One route between the kitchens and medical tent. Another leading toward the mechanics' shelters. Another descending toward the frozen stream where water is collected each morning despite the cold. The camp has developed its own geography, its own rhythms, its own weather of human movement. At midday, the mechanics attempt once more to restore a transport truck that has not functioned properly since autumn. The vehicle rests beneath a patched top near the southern perimeter with its engine partially dismantled across several crates. One mechanic kneels inside the exposed machinery while another warms his hands against a lantern before passing tools back and forth through clouds of visible breath. The truck may never leave the camp. That possibility no longer prevents the repairs. Nearby, several soldiers gather around a radio receiver positioned carefully atop stacked ammunition boxes inside the communications shelter. The signal fades in and out beneath layers of static caused by weather moving across the mountains farther east. Occasionally, music emerges briefly through the interference before dissolving again into noise. Then voices. News bulletins from distant cities discussing reconstruction conferences, border agreements, shortages, elections, rebuilding efforts. The war survives now through paperwork and speeches. For the stranded soldiers, this transformation feels strangely unreal. One man listening near the doorway remarks quietly that politicians now speak about the war the way old men discuss whether already past. Another says nothing at all, only staring toward the frost gathering along the radio wires entering through the shelter wall. Combat once compressed experience into immediate physical certainty. Hunger, noise, movement, fear. Now history itself has become administrative. The men do not know how to live inside administration yet. During the afternoon, snow begins falling again in fine dry particles drifting almost sideways across the camp roads. Visibility shortens. The distant hills disappear entirely behind pale moving curtains of white. Inside the shelters, conversations grow softer beneath blankets wrapped tightly around shoulders and knees. Card games continue beneath lantern light while kettles steam gently beside the stoves. One soldier carves tiny wooden animals from leftover crate timber using a pocket knife sharpened, nearly transparent from years of use. Another repairs eyeglasses using wire stripped from field telephones abandoned during the retreat months earlier. Small tasks become anchors here. The mind requires occupation when time itself loses structure. You watch a nurse move between tents carrying a tray of medicine bottles wrapped carefully beneath cloth against the cold. She knows many of the men by name now. Not because of military rank, but because the camp has existed long enough for repetition to create familiarity deeper than formal organization. She knows which soldier coughs worse after dusk, which one cannot sleep when trains pass in the valley below, which men pretend to improve because they fear delayed transport if classified unfit for travel. The stranded condition changes relationships quietly. People stop seeing uniforms first. They begin seeing endurance instead. Near evening, a truck arrives carrying replacement personnel assigned temporarily from another encampment farther south. The new arrivals climb down stiffly into snow they were not expecting, carrying equipment marked by entirely different units and fronts. Their faces still possess the sharper alertness of men recently removed from active movement. They ask questions immediately. How long are the delays here? Which routes remain open? When does the next transport leave northward? The older soldiers answer gently now. Not cruelly. That change matters too. Several months earlier the camp might have greeted optimism with sarcasm or irritation. But repetition has altered the emotional atmosphere. The stranded soldiers recognize themselves in the newcomers too clearly. One veteran helps unload blankets from the truck before quietly warning a younger man to keep his boots dry at night because replacements are difficult to obtain now. Another explains which tents leak least during storms. These are not battlefield lessons. These are settlement lessons. Darkness arrives early beneath the snowfall. Lanterns begin glowing through the camp once more while smoke gathers low between the shelters and supply depots. Somewhere near the kitchens, someone laughs unexpectedly at a story repeated too many times already. Nearby, a sentry stamps warmth back into his boots beside the northern fence while staring down the road slowly disappearing beneath fresh snow. The repetition continues surrounding them from every direction now. Morning fires. Inspection lines. Paperwork. Repairs. Soup. Snow. Sleep. Then morning again. And still no one can say when the waiting will end. Night settles into the camp with practiced familiarity now, as though darkness itself has learned the layout of the shelters and roads. Lanterns glow behind layers of canvas like distant ships trapped in fog. Smoke from the stoves drifts low beneath the snowfall before flattening across the frozen hillside. The camp no longer feels temporary after sunset. Temporary places resist routine. This place has begun accepting it. Inside the shelters, men arrange themselves almost identically each evening without discussion. The same blankets near the stove. The same crates used as tables. The same boots lined carefully near entrances where melting snow can drain away during the night. Habits repeat with such precision that absence becomes immediately visible. When one soldier fails to return from kitchen duty on time, several others glance toward the entrance instinctively before conversation continues. People stranded together long enough begin organizing themselves through repetition rather than hierarchy alone. A lieutenant sits near the rear of one tent writing reports beneath weak lantern light while the others nearby play cards in near silence. The reports concern supply levels, illness rates, transport readiness, structural maintenance. Every evening he records nearly identical information using slightly different numbers. Fuel low but stable. Minor respiratory infections increasing. Road conditions difficult. Awaiting revised transport authorization. The language of suspension has become standardized. Even the paperwork sounds tired now. You watch frost forming gradually along the inside edges of the tent canvas while the men speak quietly about ordinary things. One describes the smell of sawdust inside his father's workshop during winter. Another remembers tram bells echoing through wet streets at dawn before factory shifts began. Their memories arrive without dramatic emotion attached to them. That is another change the repetition has created. Earlier in the waiting, memories of home carried visible longing. Now they emerge more gently, almost academically, like observations from another life studied at distance. The war interrupted civilian existence violently. The waiting afterward stretches that interruption until memory itself begins thinning at the edges. Outside, the sentries continue their patrols along paths worn smooth through the snow by weeks of identical movement. Boots compress ice into polished surfaces reflecting moonlight between the tents. One guard pauses beside the communications shelter where radio static hums faintly through the walls even at this hour. Operators work in rotating shifts because headquarters still expects messages to arrive eventually. Orders, reassignments, updated border clearances, confirmation of transport routes reopening. The expectation persists because abandoning expectation entirely would feel too close to surrender. And armies are trained carefully against surrender. Near midnight, a freight train passes somewhere far beyond the valley again. The sound travels slowly through the cold air, softer than before beneath the falling snow, but unmistakable all the same. Several men inside the shelters stop speaking for a moment as the distant wheels move across unseen rails in the darkness. No one rises now. No one steps outside searching the horizon. The repetition has altered hope as well. Hope no longer surges here. It settles quietly into the background like a weak but persistent light. A mechanic working late near the generators listens to the fading whistle while tightening bolts stiffened by frost. He no longer imagines the trains arriving tomorrow. Instead, he imagines hearing one stop unexpectedly at the camp months from now, after he has almost forgotten to expect it at all. This is how prolonged waiting reshapes imagination. The mind protects itself by lowering the volume of certainty without extinguishing it completely. Snow gathers thicker through the night. By dawn, the roads crossing the camp resemble pale rivers winding between rounded shelters and frozen vehicles buried gradually deeper each week. Several trucks now require digging before their engines can even be reached properly for maintenance. The artillery pieces near the northern fence appear strangely ceremonial beneath the snow, less like weapons than monuments left standing after their purpose ended. Yet every morning the crews still uncover them. Brush snow from the barrels. Check the wheels. Oil the mechanisms. You watch one man spend nearly an hour repairing the handle of a spoon using wire and cloth wrapping because replacement utensils are difficult to acquire now. The care invested in such a small object feels disproportionate until you understand the deeper logic governing the camp. Small repairs create visible success. The spoon breaks. The spoon is repaired. Cause and resolution remain clear. In the larger structure surrounding the soldiers, nothing resolves clearly anymore. And so the mind clings to manageable acts. A repaired spoon. A dry blanket. A functioning watch. An organized shelf. By afternoon, the snowfall finally stops and weak sunlight spreads briefly across the camp for the first time in many days. Men emerge from the shelters almost instinctively, standing beside the roads or sitting atop supply crates simply to feel light on their faces again. Steam rises from thawing canvas roofs. Meltwater drips steadily from the parked trucks. Somewhere near the kitchens, someone begins washing uniforms in partially unfrozen barrels despite the cold. The sunlight changes the emotional atmosphere immediately. Not dramatically. Only enough to remind the camp that weather itself still moves forward even when the soldiers cannot. Several men gather beside the southern road watching distant hills emerge once more from behind the storm clouds. One remarks that spring will eventually make the roads passable again. Another says rail repairs may progress faster once the rivers thaw. The conversation continues cautiously, without conviction strong enough to become dangerous. Because by now the camp understands something important. Hope survives longer when spoken softly. As evening approaches again, The same fires are lit. The same lanterns glow awake behind canvas walls. The same lines form beside the kitchens beneath drifting smoke and deepening cold. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the perimeter, another train moves through another valley carrying strangers toward destinations the stranded soldiers can no longer picture clearly. And still the camp repeats itself carefully against the silence. One day at a time. Bureaucracies of delay. The paperwork begins accumulating faster than the snow. At first the documents arrived in manageable stacks carried inside leather satchels by officers traveling between regional commands. Transfer authorizations, fuel requests, personnel confirmations, medical certifications, lists of names typed hurriedly across thin sheets already creased from too many hands. But as winter deepens and the stranded condition hardens around the camp, the paperwork multiplies beyond proportion. Entire tables inside headquarters disappear beneath it. Folders tied with string. Carbon copies stained blue with ink. Maps folded and unfolded until their corners split apart. Reports stamped by offices hundreds of miles away and already outdated before arrival. The administrative machinery surrounding the army has swollen into something vast, cold, and difficult to see clearly from inside. The soldiers feel its presence constantly without ever fully touching it. Each morning, clerks begin work before dawn beneath yellow lamps hanging low over the headquarters tables. Their fingers move steadily through forms while typewriters clatter against the silence outside. Steam rises from cups of coffee gone cold faster than they can drink it. One clerk sharpens pencils repeatedly with a pocket knife because supplies arrive irregularly now. Another spends entire afternoons comparing personnel lists against transport manifests whose numbers never quite align anymore. The war once measured movement in kilometers. Now movement is measured in signatures. You watch a lieutenant stand beside the communications table waiting for confirmation regarding a transport convoy requested nearly 3 weeks earlier. The radio operator listens through static while adjusting dials slowly beneath headphones worn smooth from constant use. Somewhere beyond the mountains, another office receives the request. Then another. Then another. Questions return instead of approvals. Clarify unit numbers. Confirm medical classifications. Await revised territorial guidance. The lieutenant writes each response carefully despite already knowing the likely outcome. Delay has developed its own language. The soldiers waiting outside headquarters understand this language instinctively by now. They recognize phrases signaling postponement disguised as procedure. Under review. Pending clarification. Awaiting coordination. Temporarily suspended. Administrative restructuring. These words circulate through the camp like weather reports, altering mood without ever offering resolution. One corporal jokes quietly near the kitchens that the war ended only because the paperwork became too heavy to transport farther. Because somewhere beyond the camp, families continue waiting for names to move through systems still struggling to understand where millions of people now belong. Inside the administration tent, heat from the stoves mixes with the smell of damp paper and typewriter oil. The air feels thicker here than anywhere else in the camp. More crowded. More exhausted. Officers remove gloves while sorting documents only to put them back on moments later as cold air slips through the canvas seams. One major rubs his eyes repeatedly while reviewing transport capacities across rail networks damaged by weather and overuse. Too many soldiers. Too few trains. Too many borders rewritten simultaneously. Too many governments rebuilding themselves while attempting to move entire armies home at once. The scale of the problem hangs invisibly over every conversation. You stand near the entrance as a private approaches the desk carrying a request for compassionate reassignment after learning through a letter that his father died during the harvest months earlier. The clerk receiving the document reads it silently before placing it atop another stack already awaiting review. Neither man speaks for several seconds. The private eventually nods once and leaves without argument because both understand the truth immediately. The request may be justified. That does not mean movement will follow. The process takes hours. Birthplaces no longer align neatly with current borders. Units dissolved during retreats lack complete transfer records. Some soldiers carry identification papers issued by governments already replaced entirely since the war began. One man discovers that according to the latest documentation, he technically belongs to a military district now controlled by another nation altogether. No one knows how to process this properly. The officers improvise. That has become another defining feature of the stranded condition. Systems continue functioning outwardly while internally relying almost entirely on improvisation. Temporary solutions layered atop previous temporary solutions until the structure itself begins resembling permanent uncertainty. Near evening, the camp generator briefly fails during a snowstorm while several clerks are still working. The headquarters tent falls suddenly into darkness except for the glow of cigarettes and the pale outline of snow blowing sideways outside the entrance. For several moments no one moves. Then lanterns are lit. Candles positioned carefully between stacks of papers. Work resumes almost immediately. The interruption changes nothing. Delay simply continues under different lighting. A captain continues reviewing transport rosters by candlelight while melted wax gathers slowly beside his elbow. Across from him, another officer studies weather reports predicting heavier snowfall across the northern passes within days. Several rail lines may close completely if the storm worsens. More delays. More waiting. More revisions to schedules already meaningless. Yet still the forms must be completed. The army continues documenting itself carefully even while trapped in suspension. Perhaps because records create the illusion of progress. Every signature suggests movement somewhere beyond visibility. Every stamped paper implies a functioning system waiting farther ahead. The soldiers cling to these implications because the alternative would mean admitting that no one truly understands how long the stranded condition may last. Outside, darkness settles heavily across the camp once more. Snow gathers along the roofs of the shelters and the hoods of silent trucks. Lanterns flicker behind canvas walls while the roads disappear gradually beneath fresh accumulation. Somewhere inside headquarters, another document receives another stamp before joining another stack awaiting transport to another office beyond another frozen border. And still the soldiers wait inside the machinery of delay, listening to papers move where they cannot. The snowstorm strengthens overnight. By morning, the camp roads have narrowed beneath drifting white banks piled against parked trucks and supply depots. Wind moves steadily across the hillside carrying fine ice particles that sting exposed skin and gather along the seams of coats already stiff from repeated freezing and thawing. Men walk leaning slightly forward now, shoulders rounded against the cold, boots searching carefully for frozen ground beneath the snow. Still the paperwork continues. Inside headquarters, the storm changes almost nothing except the volume of the typewriters. Fewer officers arrive from surrounding sectors. Fewer vehicles manage the roads. Yet the clerks remain seated beneath lantern light while frost forms gradually along the inside edges of the tent walls. Stacks of forms rise higher across the tables. Some are weighted down with mugs or ammunition boxes to prevent loose pages from lifting each time the wind enters through the canvas flaps. You watch one clerk pause occasionally to breathe warmth against his fingers before returning to the same repetitive motions. stamp, sign, sort, record, file, forward. The rhythm resembles factory work more than military command now. Near the communications shelter, several soldiers stand outside waiting for updated transport classifications expected through radio transmission from regional headquarters. They stamp warmth back into their boots while snow settles across their shoulders and caps. Nobody speaks much. Experience has taught them that information arrives slowly and changes often. After nearly 2 hours, the operator emerges holding a single sheet of paper dampened by condensation from the radio equipment inside. 3 names removed from the departure list. 2 transfers postponed indefinitely. No explanation provided. The men read the notice silently before dispersing without protest. That silence would have been impossible earlier in the waiting. Back then delays still felt temporary enough to resist emotionally. Now the soldiers absorb administrative disappointments with the weary caution of men handling fragile objects already cracked from previous impact. One private folds the notice carefully before placing it inside his coat pocket as though preserving proof of something difficult to explain later. He sits each evening near the stove helping others reorganize papers into cleaner packets tied with string scavenged from supply crates. The camp has begun producing specialists for waiting. That realization unsettles some of the older officers more than open disobedience ever would. Near midday, an argument erupts briefly inside headquarters when 2 transport officers discover overlapping authorizations assigning the same limited convoy space to different units. Voices rise sharply enough for soldiers outside to hear fragments through the tent walls. Fuel shortages. Priority directives. Incomplete casualty revisions. One officer accuses the other of bypassing regional procedures entirely. Another slams a folder onto the table hard enough to scatter papers across the floorboards. Then suddenly the noise stops. Not because the disagreement resolves. Only because exhaustion overtakes anger more quickly now. A few moments later, the officers resume speaking in lower tones while gathering the fallen documents from the floor. The administrative machinery cannot afford emotional collapse. Too many lives remain trapped inside it. Outside the tent, snow continues falling steadily across parked vehicles whose engines are started less frequently each week to conserve fuel. One transport truck has not moved in nearly a month. And buried inside that enormous movement sits this quiet hillside camp where thousands of soldiers wait for papers to travel farther than they can. One form at a time through the snow. Men beginning to drift. The first signs of drifting appear quietly enough to resemble fatigue. A soldier misses morning roll call after sleeping through the bell despite normally waking before dawn. Another forgets to clean his rifle properly for the first time in months. A mechanic leaves tools outside overnight beneath snowfall because he no longer remembers where he intended to place them. Small failures. Minor lapses. Nothing serious individually. Yet together they begin altering the atmosphere of the camp in ways difficult to measure directly. The officers notice before the soldiers do. Discipline has not collapsed. Orders are still followed. Nearby, a transport driver sits inside the cab of a silent truck smoking slowly while snow melts across the windshield outside. Earlier in the winter, idle moments still carried tension. Now idleness lingers more naturally. The camp no longer behaves like a place preparing constantly for movement. At breakfast, conversations stretch thinner across the tables. Men still speak, but more often in fragments separated by long pauses filled with the sound of spoons against metal tins and wind moving outside the kitchens. News from home arrives less frequently now as postal systems struggle beneath winter conditions and political restructuring across multiple borders. Entire weeks pass without letters for many of the soldiers. The absence settles heavily over the camp even when unspoken. A corporal unfolds an old photograph beside the stove while eating. You notice him staring at it not with longing exactly, but with concentration, as though trying to preserve details against gradual fading. Beside him, another soldier cannot remember whether the bakery near his childhood apartment stood on the left side of the street or the right. The uncertainty troubles him more than he admits aloud. Memory requires reinforcement. The stranded condition interrupts reinforcement slowly enough that men rarely recognize what is disappearing until after it has already faded. Outside the shelters, the snow has begun compacting into layered ice beneath repeated footsteps. Camp roads gleam hard and uneven beneath pale winterlight. Men walk carefully now, balancing buckets, firewood, stacks of paperwork, all moving through identical routes repeated so often the body follows them automatically without conscious thought. Repetition protects the camp. It also hollows it. Near midday, a transport authorization finally arrives for a small group of soldiers reassigned southward toward functioning rail lines beyond the mountains. The announcement spreads rapidly through the camp, though not with the excitement such news might once have generated. The selected men themselves appear almost stunned while gathering their equipment beneath drifting snow. One spends nearly an hour reorganizing items already packed days earlier. Another sits motionless on his bunk staring at the departure notice in silence before beginning to fold his blankets with excessive care. The camp watches departures differently now. Earlier in the waiting, each departing convoy seemed proof that movement remained possible. Hope expanded outward from every leaving vehicle. But months of delays and revisions have complicated those emotions. Departures now carry traces of unease alongside relief. Men leaving the camp enter another system of uncertainty immediately afterward. More checkpoints. More administrative offices. More temporary shelters farther along the broken transportation routes. The journey home has fragmented into stages no one fully understands. You stand near the northern road as the departing soldiers load their packs into the back of a transport truck warmed reluctantly to life after days frozen motionless beneath snow. Several men from nearby shelters help secure blankets and supply crates without speaking much. Goodbyes remain restrained. The camp has learned caution around hope. When the truck finally begins moving, many soldiers continue watching long after it disappears beyond the white hills. Not because they envy the men leaving exactly, but because movement itself has become unfamiliar. Inside headquarters, the officers discuss rising concerns regarding discipline in surrounding camps across the region. Desertions, black market activity, unauthorized departures, minor thefts, fights erupting over food, cigarettes, transport priority. Nothing catastrophic yet, but enough to reveal strain beneath the surface of prolonged waiting. One captain remarks quietly that armies are designed for hardship, not suspension. Hardship contains purpose. Suspension erodes it. The camp still remains comparatively stable. Much of that stability comes from routine maintained carefully by both officers and enlisted men alike. Yet signs of inward drifting continue appearing in small ways difficult to regulate directly. Soldiers sleep at irregular hours. Personal hygiene weakens for some while becoming obsessive for others. Certain men volunteer constantly for extra work details simply to avoid idle time. Others withdraw almost entirely outside mandatory duties. A medic describes the condition privately as emotional frostbite. The phrase spreads quietly afterward. Not officially. only between conversations beside stoves and lanterns after dark. One evening, a sentry stationed near the eastern perimeter abandons his post briefly to warm himself beside the kitchens without authorization. He returns before inspection and receives only a mild reprimand after explaining numbness in his hands from the cold. Months earlier, such behavior might have triggered formal punishment immediately. Now the officers hesitate more often before enforcing regulations harshly, because they feel the same exhaustion themselves. The distinction between discipline and endurance grows harder to separate over time. You watch the command staff during supper inside headquarters, where maps still cover the walls though fewer people study them with urgency now. Officers eat slowly while discussing transport shortages, revised border procedures, disease outbreaks in southern transit camps. One major pauses halfway through a sentence as though forgetting briefly what he intended to say. Another stares at snowfall moving beyond the tent entrance for so long that his coffee grows cold untouched beside him. The stranded condition respects no rank. Outside, darkness lowers gradually across the hillside once more. Smoke drifts from the chimneys. Lanterns glow behind frosted canvas walls. Somewhere a harmonica begins playing softly near the western shelters before stopping midway through the melody. The unfinished notes hang briefly in the cold air before dissolving into silence. The camp continues functioning. That remains true. But something inside it has begun loosening now beneath the repetition, the snow, and the endless machinery of delay. The soldiers still wear uniforms. Still answer roll call. Still maintain roads leading nowhere. Yet more and more often, their minds seem to wander beyond the perimeter long before their bodies ever can. The drifting becomes easier to notice after sunset. Daylight still imposes enough structure to conceal certain changes. Work details continue. Inventories are checked. Roads cleared. Stoves repaired. But at night, when the camp settles inward beneath snow and lantern light, the quieter fractures emerge more clearly between the routines holding everything together. One soldier begins walking in his sleep. At first the others inside his shelter think he is merely waking early for kitchen duty because they hear movement before dawn and see his boots crossing the frozen floorboards near the entrance. Then one night a sentry finds him standing near the southern fence without gloves or cap, staring toward the buried road while snow gathers along his shoulders. When spoken to, he responds calmly enough, though later he remembers almost nothing about leaving the tent. Afterward, several men begin sleeping lighter than before. Not from fear, only from awareness that the waiting has begun entering dreams as well. Inside another shelter, a former artilleryman develops the habit of polishing his boots late into the night long after inspections have ended. He sits near the stove rubbing dark wax carefully into the leather while the others sleep around him beneath blankets and drifting shadows cast by the lantern flame. The boots already shine perfectly. Still he continues polishing them with slow mechanical focus, sometimes for hours. No one tells him to stop. The camp understands instinctively that people preserve themselves differently inside prolonged suspension. You watch a pair of mechanics arguing quietly beside the generators over whether a damaged truck engine is worth repairing anymore. Months earlier neither man would have questioned the task itself. Repair work carried automatic purpose then. Now the discussion circles not around possibility, but meaning. Fuel shortages continue worsening. Convoys arrive less often. Several vehicles repaired carefully during autumn now sit buried motionless beneath snowdrifts because no transport orders ever came. Eventually one mechanic shrugs and resumes tightening bolts anyway. Not because he believes the truck will leave. Only because unfinished work has become difficult to tolerate psychologically. Near midnight, Wind moves through the camp hard enough to rattle loose canvas and shake frost from the shelter ropes. Men wake briefly across the hillside, listening to the weather move over them like distant surf. Somewhere beyond the northern perimeter, a dog barks from a nearby village before falling silent again. The sound unsettles some of the soldiers more than artillery once did. Civilian noises now feel strangely distant, almost intrusive. The stranded condition has created its own enclosed world. Outside it, ordinary life continues at proportions the soldiers no longer fully recognize. Inside headquarters, a lieutenant studies transport reports while rubbing his eyes against exhaustion that no longer disappears after sleep. He notices increasing irregularities among the men under his supervision. Missed inspections, minor carelessness, sudden emotional withdrawal. Yet he hesitates to report these changes formally because official reports transform human exhaustion into categories too narrow to contain it. Low morale, reduced efficiency, psychological fatigue. The phrases feel insufficient beside what he actually observes each day. Men drifting slowly away from themselves without any single dramatic collapse. At the kitchens, the cooks now distribute meals to several soldiers who no longer bother arriving on time unless specifically ordered. Hunger itself has changed rhythm inside the camp. During active campaigns, food carried urgency because movement consumed the body constantly. Here, days unfold more slowly. Some men forget meals entirely while others eat mechanically without appetite. One cook begins setting aside extra bread for a young private recovering from illness because the boy reminds him of his younger brother at home. The gesture remains unofficial. Small acts of informal care increasingly sustain the camp beneath the visible structure of military order. That change matters. Armies rely on hierarchy during combat. Suspended armies survive through quieter forms of mutual preservation. You stand near the frozen stream beyond the western shelters where several soldiers collect water beneath moonlight using buckets and chipped metal containers. The ice has thickened enough that they must break through it each morning with axes before lowering the buckets carefully into the black moving water beneath. One man pauses during the work to stare at his reflection trembling between broken sheets of ice. He looks older now than when winter began. Most of them do. Not dramatically. Only around the eyes. Back near the shelters, card games continue later each night because fewer men sleep easily anymore. The games themselves matter less than the continuity surrounding them. Familiar rules. Predictable turns. Repeated gestures performed beneath lantern light while wind presses softly against the canvas walls outside. One player shuffles the worn deck with unconscious precision developed through hundreds of identical evenings. The cards smell faintly of smoke and damp wool. Like the camp itself. A medic moving between shelters after midnight notices another subtle change emerging among the soldiers. Fewer arguments. Fewer sudden bursts of anger. At first this appears positive. Then gradually he understands the truth beneath it. Emotional energy is thinning overall. Even irritation requires momentum. The camp is entering a quieter stage now where many men conserve themselves internally without realizing they are doing so. The waiting has become less dramatic, which makes it more dangerous. One evening, a replacement officer recently assigned from another sector attempts to organize physical training exercises near the southern road to restore discipline and morale. The soldiers comply respectfully enough. Running drills. Equipment inspections. Formation exercises across packed snow beneath pale winter sunlight. Yet the effort carries an unmistakable hollowness. The men move correctly, but without internal connection to the activity itself. The officer notices it immediately. These are not rebellious soldiers, nor defeated ones. They are suspended soldiers. And suspension drains motion differently than fear ever could. After the exercises end, many return quietly to the same routines waiting for them before. Repair work, stove maintenance, administrative lines, snow clearing. One private sits beside the road afterward, carving shapes into the ice with the heel of his boot while staring toward distant hills hidden beneath cloud cover. He remains there long enough that snow begins collecting across his shoulders unnoticed. You realize then how still the camp has become internally despite all its visible activity. Everything continues moving. Nothing truly advances. Toward dawn, another train passes faintly through the valley below, its whistle carried softly across the frozen hills before dissolving into the dark. Few men react anymore. Some hear it without opening their eyes. Others continue sleeping beneath blankets and drifting lantern shadows while the sound fades into distance once more. The repetition has absorbed even longing now. And somewhere beneath that repetition, the soldiers themselves are beginning to loosen quietly from the people they were before the roads stopped moving. Small economies of waiting. The first trades begin harmlessly. A pair of dry socks exchanged for cigarettes. Extra blanket space near the stove traded for kitchen duty during snowfall. A sharpened razor passed between shelters in return for coffee grounds saved carefully across several mornings. Nothing formal. Nothing forbidden exactly. Merely the quiet adjustments people make when official systems no longer meet the full shape of daily life. Yet over time, the trades deepen. The camp develops its own economy slowly enough that few can identify precisely when it began. You notice it first near the supply tents where soldiers linger after inventory distribution longer than necessary, speaking in lowered voices while examining tins of preserved meat or bars of soap with subtle concentration. Certain items now carry unusual value depending on weather, illness, memory, or simple emotional need. Tobacco becomes precious during storms. Writing paper during holidays. Dry gloves after transport delays leave replacement shipments stranded farther south. Objects drift away from their intended purpose here. A mechanic trades engine grease to a cook whose stove hinges have frozen repeatedly in the cold. The cook later exchanges extra bread portions for needles and thread gathered from a medic repairing torn blankets. Nearby, another soldier quietly barters foreign chocolate carried since autumn for help rewriting administrative forms he barely understands. No one describes these exchanges as commerce. They feel more like adaptation. The officers tolerate much of it because official supply chains remain too inconsistent to prohibit improvisation entirely. Even headquarters relies increasingly on informal arrangements now. One clerk secures additional lamp oil from the mechanics in exchange for prioritizing their equipment requests inside transport manifests. Another obtains warmer gloves through favors owed by kitchen personnel. The bureaucracy above the camp remains rigid. The camp itself becomes flexible beneath it. You walk beside the northern shelters where several soldiers have constructed shelves from scavenged crate timber to organize personal belongings that once fit easily inside standard military packs. The accumulation happens gradually. Extra spoons. Additional scarves. Tools traded across units. Civilian objects picked from abandoned villages. Books passed hand to hand until their bindings separate. Stranded armies begin collecting things. Movement requires lightness. Waiting encourages possession. One evening, a barber offers haircuts beside the stove in exchange for candle wax and tobacco. Men line up patiently beneath hanging lantern light while snow drifts against the shelter walls outside. The barber works carefully despite the informal arrangement, brushing loose hair from collars with almost ceremonial precision afterward. Clean hair restores proportion. It reminds the soldiers their bodies still belong partly to civilian existence rather than endless suspension. Beside him, another man repairs fountain pens using salvaged springs and bits of rubber cut from damaged vehicle parts. His customers arrive carrying pens wrapped carefully in cloth as though presenting surgical instruments. Writing has become deeply important here. Letters remain one of the few ways the soldiers can project themselves beyond the perimeter fences physically containing them. A functioning pen now carries emotional weight disproportionate to its size. The camp understands this instinctively. Near headquarters, a quieter trade begins emerging around information itself. Certain clerks gain reputations for knowing which transport requests move fastest through regional command. Which classifications improve reassignment chances? Which medical reports are likely to delay departure indefinitely? Soldiers seek these men discreetly after dark, carrying cigarettes, coffee, spare gloves, anything useful enough to encourage extra attention toward paperwork buried beneath thousands of other forms. The clerks rarely promise outcomes directly. No one truly controls outcomes anymore. But attention itself has become valuable. You watch one corporal wait nearly an hour outside the administration tent simply to ask whether rumors about Southern rail repairs might be accurate. The clerk answering him shrugs carefully before accepting a cigarette and quietly mentioning that fuel convoys passed through the western checkpoints earlier that week. Nothing certain. Only fragments. Yet fragments sustain hope longer than silence. The war produced black markets through scarcity. The waiting produces them through uncertainty. At the kitchens, the cooks now reserve unofficial portions for men working late shifts or returning frozen from snow-clearing details. These extra servings rarely appear in official records. The officers know this. Most choose not to interfere unless supplies run dangerously low. Strict regulation becomes difficult when survival increasingly depends upon small acts of informal adjustment invisible to the paperwork governing the camp. One major remarks privately that official systems feed armies, but unofficial systems keep them human. Outside, winter continues tightening around the hillside. Snowbanks rise higher against the vehicles and supply sheds. Roads narrow beneath repeated freezing and thawing. Convoys arrive less frequently now, which only increases the emotional value of whatever does manage to enter the camp. Fresh bread from a southern depot. Medical alcohol. Newspapers. Soap with actual scent instead of industrial harshness. Men gather around new arrivals not with greed exactly, but hunger for variation. Repetition has made novelty feel luxurious. Near the western perimeter, several soldiers secretly construct a tiny stove inside an abandoned maintenance shelter using parts scavenged from damaged fuel drums and artillery casings. They meet there occasionally after evening roll call to drink weak tea brewed from herbs gathered during autumn before the frost hardened the ground completely. One man brings sugar saved carefully from old rations. Another carries cards. Another reads aloud from a novel missing its final chapters. The shelter becomes valuable precisely because it exists outside official structure. Not rebellious. Simply private. The stranded condition slowly increases the emotional importance of unsupervised spaces. You stand near the southern road one afternoon while a transport truck unloads supplies beneath grey skies carrying the smell of approaching snow once more. Among the crates sits a shipment of winter coats intended for another encampment entirely. The paperwork accompanying them contains conflicting unit numbers and signatures already crossed out twice. An officer studies the documents for several minutes before finally ordering the coats distributed locally anyway. No one expects the bureaucracy to notice quickly. If it notices at all. That moment captures the camp perfectly now. Rules still exist. Systems still function outwardly. Yet beneath the surface, daily survival increasingly depends on improvisation, exchange, quiet negotiation, and the willingness to bend procedures without fully breaking them. Because the soldiers have begun understanding something difficult. The machinery responsible for eventually sending them home is not truly failing. It is simply too large and too exhausted to see them clearly anymore. So the camp adjusts itself instead. One trade, one favor, one unofficial kindness at a time beneath the snow. The trades continue deepening through winter until almost every object inside the camp carries two values at once: its official purpose and its practical worth within the waiting. A blanket is no longer merely issued equipment. It becomes warmth near the stove, bargaining leverage during storms, privacy folded around a soldier trying to sleep while others remain awake nearby. A bar of soap means cleanliness officially, but unofficially it also means the ability to feel briefly civilian again after weeks of smoke, damp wool, and frozen mud. Even empty jars acquire importance. Men store nails inside them, tea leaves, buttons, salt saved carefully from kitchen rations. Nothing leaves the camp easily now. Everything stays useful longer than intended. Inside one shelter near the eastern perimeter, a former tailor has begun altering uniforms in exchange for candles and coffee. Soldiers arrive carrying coats with torn seams, sleeves too short after receiving mismatched replacements, collars frayed from constant wear. The tailor works beneath lantern light with patient concentration while snow presses softly against the canvas walls outside. His fingers move slowly through the fabric as though repairing not just clothing, but continuity itself. Several men request civilian-style adjustments quietly. Hidden interior pockets. Less rigid collars. Buttons replaced with ordinary ones scavenged from abandoned homes. The changes remain subtle enough to avoid disciplinary attention, yet emotionally they matter deeply. The soldiers are beginning to soften their relationship to military identity without admitting it openly. You watch one artilleryman studying himself in a cracked mirror after receiving a repaired coat lined secretly with cloth from an old civilian overcoat. He touches the new fabric near the collar almost absent-mindedly before stepping back into the snow outside. The gesture feels private, almost fragile. Near the kitchens, a quieter economy develops around memory itself. Men trade stories repeatedly because familiar stories stabilize the mind against repetition. One soldier becomes known for describing train journeys through the mountains before the war with such detail that others gather near the stove simply to hear him speak again. Another recalls recipes from his mother's bakery, though no ingredients exist here to recreate them properly. A former teacher recites poems from memory after evening meals in exchange for cigarettes and tea. Nothing tangible changes hands during these exchanges. Still, they carry value. Perhaps more than the objects do. At headquarters, the officers face increasingly difficult decisions regarding shortages that official reports cannot fully conceal anymore. Fuel reserves shrink. Medicine arrives inconsistently. Winter boots wear through faster than replacements appear. Yet despite these strains, punishments remain surprisingly rare across the camp. That softness unsettles some senior commanders farther up the chain. Reports arrive warning against erosion of military discipline and informal distribution structures. But the officers living inside the stranded condition understand realities invisible from distant headquarters. Strict enforcement would preserve regulations at the expense of morale already stretched thin by months of uncertainty. And morale now functions like heat. Easy to lose. Difficult to restore. One evening, Military police discover several soldiers operating an unauthorized exchange inside a storage shelter where food, tobacco, soap, and civilian items gathered from nearby villages have been circulating informally for weeks. Earlier in the war, such activity might have resulted in immediate arrests. Instead, the commanding officer quietly confiscates only the most excessive supplies before dismissing the men with warnings. Later that night, the confiscated food quietly reappears through the kitchens. No one mentions how. The camp protects itself instinctively now against unnecessary harshness. You stand near the communications shelter while snow drifts sideways beneath pale lantern light and watch a radio operator trade half his tobacco ration for additional listening time on a civilian broadcast frequency. Music emerges faintly through the static. Piano. A woman singing somewhere far away in a language several nearby soldiers barely understand. Yet the shelter grows silent while they listen. The music belongs to functioning civilian time. Restaurants. Apartments. Evening broadcasts. Ordinary exhaustion rather than military suspension. When the signal fades again into static, no one speaks immediately afterward. The silence itself becomes part of the exchange. Near the Western Road, several mechanics have transformed an abandoned truck trailer into an unofficial workshop where men repair watches, boots, pens, eyeglasses, cooking utensils, anything capable of extending usefulness a little longer. Lanterns glow inside late into the evenings while snow piles against the wheels outside. The trailer smells of oil, leather, damp wool, and metal warmed briefly by human hands. The work happening there feels almost devotional. Not because the objects matter greatly on their own, but because repair implies continuation. One mechanic spends nearly 2 hours restoring the clasp on a soldier's broken watch, even after admitting the internal mechanism still loses several minutes each day. When he finishes, the owner thanks him with unusual seriousness before trading away 2 precious cigarettes. The watch does not need accuracy anymore. It only needs movement. The stranded condition changes what people consider sufficient. During the night, wind rattles the shelters hard enough to wake parts of the camp repeatedly before dawn. Men rise to tighten ropes, reinforce canvas seams, clear drifting snow away from stovepipes before smoke backs into the tents. These tasks happen automatically now. No officer orders them. No whistle signals urgency. The camp has begun sustaining itself beneath official structure rather than because of it. That distinction grows clearer each week. By morning, frost coats nearly every exposed surface across the encampment. Trucks gleam pale beneath ice. Fence wires hum softly in the wind. Soldiers move through familiar paths carrying buckets, firewood, paperwork, steaming tins of soup, all while exchanging small favors so naturally they barely resemble transactions anymore. A pair of gloves passed to a sentry with numb fingers. Extra lamp oil shared between shelters. A repaired boot sole. Half a letter translated from another language. Someone saving a place near the stove. You realize these exchanges form an invisible infrastructure beneath the visible army. The official systems keep the camp functioning outwardly. The unofficial systems keep the men from emotionally freezing in place. Toward evening, another convoy finally arrives through the northern road carrying replacement fuel and several crates of Christmas parcels delayed for weeks by weather and collapsed rail lines farther east. The reaction across the camp spreads quickly but quietly. Men gather near the unloading area with expressions carefully restrained against disappointment in case the parcels are incomplete. Many are. Some boxes arrive crushed or partially opened. Others contain items no longer useful after months of delay. Melted sweets. Damp clothing. Newspapers already old enough to feel historical. Yet the emotional effect remains powerful all the same. Soldiers carry the parcels back through the snow with almost ceremonial care. Not because of what the packages contain exactly, but because someone somewhere still imagined them returning home eventually. That belief matters, even second-hand. Night lowers itself across the camp once more while lanterns glow behind frosted canvas and smoke drifts across the frozen hillside. Somewhere inside the shelters, gifts are quietly divided, traded, saved, or shared beside the stoves. The roads remain buried beneath snow. The paperwork continues accumulating. The trains still pass distantly through valleys carrying strangers elsewhere. And beneath it all, the small economies of waiting continue binding the stranded soldiers together, one careful exchange at a time. The officers growing quiet. The officers begin disappearing into silence long before their authority weakens visibly. At first the change reveals itself only in tone. Orders arrive shorter. Meetings end earlier. Conversations inside headquarters lose the sharp-clipped certainty that once carried naturally through military command. Men who previously argued over strategy for hours now spend entire evenings studying transport manifests without speaking more than necessary. Fatigue settles differently upon officers because they must continue performing direction even after direction itself has become uncertain. The soldiers notice this immediately. Armies always do. You watch the commanding major standing outside headquarters before dawn while snow moves softly across the empty road behind him. His gloves remain tucked beneath one arm despite the cold. He stares northward for so long that a sentry eventually approaches quietly to ask whether additional patrols are needed near the perimeter. The major answers, after a delay longer than expected, "No. Continue as normal." As normal. The phrase has become central to survival here. Inside headquarters, the maps still cover the walls, though fewer markings appear upon them now. Earlier in the waiting, officers revised transport routes daily using colored pencils and pins shifted constantly across the paper. Entire evenings disappeared beneath calculations involving fuel reserves, railway capacities, weather forecasts, occupation boundaries. But repetition has worn against that urgency gradually. Some maps now remain untouched for weeks except where moisture curls their edges inward. One captain removes a pin absent-mindedly during a meeting and rolls it between his fingers while others discuss delays farther south. No one notices him stop listening. The stranded condition affects officers differently than enlisted men because command relies heavily upon projected confidence. Soldiers may drift quietly inward without immediately threatening structure. Officers cannot. Every hesitation becomes visible. Every uncertainty spreads outward through the camp almost instantly. And so the officers begin conserving themselves emotionally. Not from cowardice. From exhaustion. Near midday, several junior officers gather around the stove inside headquarters while snow rattles lightly against the canvas walls outside. Coffee simmers weakly nearby in a dented kettle blackened from months of use. The conversation moves slowly between topics already discussed too many times before. Fuel shortages. Delayed rail repairs. Rumors of reorganized commands farther west. One lieutenant begins describing new transport regulations before stopping halfway through the explanation as though the details no longer matter enough to finish. The silence afterward stretches comfortably rather than awkwardly. That change would have been impossible earlier in the war. Combat fills silence quickly because silence may conceal danger. Suspension allows silence to settle naturally between people too tired to maintain constant performance. Weather command vehicles still depart regularly for regional meetings beyond the valley. The camp reads these details instinctively because the officers have become emotional barometers for the stranded condition itself. One evening, the major cancels formal inspection due to weather after a heavy snowfall buries several roads and supply sheds across the hillside. Officially, the decision is practical. Unofficially, the soldiers recognize something deeper in it. The inspection would change nothing now. The men already know their uniforms are worn, their boots damaged, their weapons maintained only partially against moisture impossible to fully resist. The performance of military sharpness grows harder to sustain when everyone understands the underlying reality equally. Yet still the officers continue trying. That matters too. Near the kitchens, a lieutenant helps unload firewood without being asked after a shipment arrives late through worsening snow conditions. Earlier in the war, such work would likely have remained beneath his rank except during emergencies. Now distinctions blur more often around practical survival. The soldiers notice him carrying logs through the snow beside enlisted men and say little about it aloud afterward. But morale improves slightly that evening regardless. Hierarchy softens subtly in stranded armies. Not through rebellion. Through shared endurance. Inside one shelter, several soldiers discuss rumors regarding officers in neighboring camps requesting reassignment away from stranded sectors entirely. Some stories describe command staff drinking heavily after dark. Others speak of sudden illnesses or nervous exhaustion. No one knows which stories are true. Yet the rumors spread because they feel emotionally plausible. The officers are trapped too. That realization changes how the soldiers perceive them. You watch the medical officer walking alone beside the frozen stream after dusk with his coat unbuttoned despite the cold air. He pauses occasionally to study the black water moving beneath the ice before continuing farther into the snow. Earlier in the waiting, officers rarely wandered alone visibly like this. Their days remained crowded with reports, inspections, negotiations, endless administrative demands. Now gaps have appeared between those duties. The machinery still turns, but less tightly. Back at headquarters, evening meetings continue beneath weak lantern light while wind moves against the tent walls outside. Transport requests are reviewed again. Supply estimates recalculated again. Border permissions revised again. Yet increasingly the discussions circle familiar obstacles without genuine expectation of immediate resolution. One captain remarks quietly during a pause that they spend more time managing waiting than managing soldiers now. No one disagrees. A clerk nearby continues typing regardless. The sound of the machine fills the silence briefly before fading again beneath the weather outside. Near midnight, the commanding major finally removes his boots beside the stove inside headquarters after remaining awake nearly 20 hours reviewing revised transport priorities from regional command. His socks are damp from melted snow. His hands tremble slightly while pouring coffee already gone cold. Across from him, another officer sleeps sitting upright in a chair with unfinished paperwork resting across his lap. The scene resembles exhaustion more than command. Yet the camp continues depending upon these men to preserve structure against drift. Outside, snow covers the roads once more. Somewhere a shovel scrapes ice from the camp road with patient repetition. The sound travels farther now that the wind has weakened overnight. Inside headquarters, several officers remain awake from the previous evening. Coffee cups stand half-finished beside transport manifests covered in corrections and fresh annotations. One lieutenant sleeps briefly with his head resting against folded arms while a clerk continues typing nearby without pause. The typewriter keys strike unevenly because two fingers on the clerk's right hand have stiffened from cold exposure during earlier campaigns. The imperfection has become part of the room's rhythm. No one comments on it anymore. The officers speak less not only because exhaustion deepens, but because certainty itself has begun thinning around them. During active war, command structures rely heavily upon momentum. Decisions produce movement. Orders generate consequence. Even mistakes create visible reactions quickly enough to preserve a sense of agency. The stranded condition interrupts that relationship completely. Now officers issue instructions that disappear into delays lasting weeks. Requests return unanswered. Convoys vanish into revised jurisdictions. Entire chains of approval collapse beneath political negotiations occurring far beyond the frozen hills surrounding the camp. Gradually, the officers learn a difficult truth. Much of command now consists of managing disappointment before it spreads. You watch a captain standing outside the administration tent while soldiers queue nearby for updated transport classifications. Snow crunches beneath boots moving through familiar paths already worn smooth by repetition. The captain reads the newest dispatch from regional headquarters twice before folding it carefully and placing it inside his coat. The dispatch changes nothing. Further delays. Weather complications. Temporary suspensions. The captain understands immediately that the men waiting nearby will study his face before hearing the actual contents. So he pauses beside the tent entrance first, smoothing fatigue from his expression as best he can. That effort alone has become part of leadership. Inside one shelter near the western perimeter, several enlisted men discuss how the officers have changed since autumn. One remarks that the major used to walk through camp inspections quickly, almost aggressively, as though movement itself could force progress from the frozen roads. Now he walks more slowly, stops longer near the kitchens, speaks with soldiers individually rather than through formal address whenever possible. Another says the officers look older after dark. No one disagrees. Near midday, Headquarters receives a visitor from Regional Command traveling with an escort vehicle barely functioning after crossing the mountain roads. The arriving colonel steps from the truck coated in snow and road salt, carrying leather cases swollen with documents. His uniform remains immaculate despite the journey, which unsettles parts of the camp immediately. Too clean. Too untouched by waiting. The officers inside headquarters greet him formally while soldiers nearby pretend not to observe. Meetings continue for hours behind closed canvas walls. Raised voices emerge briefly once during the afternoon before falling silent again. Clerks move between tents carrying additional files. Radio operators transmit coded updates toward distant command sectors already overwhelmed by similar camps spread across entire regions. Outside, speculation spreads softly beside the kitchens and stove fires. New transport orders. Camp dissolution. Disciplinary inspections. Fuel reductions. The stranded soldiers have become experts at constructing hope and fear simultaneously from incomplete information. By evening, the visiting colonel departs without addressing the camp directly. No new transport schedules appear afterward. No major policy changes follow. Only additional paperwork remains behind. The emotional effect proves heavier precisely because nothing visible changes. One mechanic remarks quietly while repairing a stove vent that even the officers now seem unable to influence events meaningfully beyond the perimeter roads. Another replies that perhaps they never could. The thought lingers afterward. Armies survive partly because soldiers believe someone farther upward still possesses clarity. The stranded condition slowly erodes that belief without ever fully destroying it. Inside headquarters after dark, the major studies casualty lists from surrounding camps where illness and exposure continue worsening through winter. Not catastrophic numbers. Only accumulation. Pneumonia. Infection. Frostbite complications. Men weakened gradually by cold, uncertainty, poor sleep, interrupted nutrition, emotional exhaustion. The deaths arrive quietly now rather than violently. That quietness burdens the officers heavily. Combat casualties carry terrible momentum and visible cause. These newer deaths feel administrative somehow. Slow disappearances occurring inside systems designed to preserve order. The major removes his glasses and rubs his eyes while the lantern beside him flickers against stacks of unfinished reports. Across the table, another officer folds a transport map so many times along the same lines that the paper finally tears near the center. He stares at the damage briefly before continuing to fold it anyway. The camp notices these small moments. Not directly, but emotionally. You stand near the northern road where two officers supervise snow-clearing crews beneath weak moonlight after another storm blocks supply access toward the valley. Earlier in the war, such labor might have been delegated entirely downward through command channels. Now the officers remain outside beside the men longer than necessary, helping direct horses, lifting frozen boards, clearing packed snow from wheel paths already buried again by drifting wind. Shared labor has become easier than maintaining distance. One lieutenant pauses midway through the work and looks southward toward the dark road disappearing into snowfall. For several seconds he simply stands there with snow gathering across his shoulders and cap while the others continue shoveling nearby. He looks less like an officer then. More like another stranded man waiting beside the frozen route home. Later that night, several soldiers overhear muted music coming from headquarters after midnight. Someone inside has found an old phonograph among confiscated civilian goods transferred through another camp months earlier. The sound emerging from the tent is faint and distorted, barely audible through wind and snow, but unmistakably civilian. A dance orchestra. Strings. Soft percussion. For a few moments the camp grows unusually still while listening. Then gradually the music stops. Lanterns dim one by one across the hillside afterward while smoke drifts low above the shelters and frozen vehicles buried deeper each week beneath winter accumulation. Somewhere beyond the mountains, governments continue negotiating borders, transport systems, occupation sectors, reconstruction plans. And here inside the snowbound camp, the officers continue preserving structure against erosion while growing quieter themselves beneath the endless responsibility of waiting with no answers to give. The camp forgetting movement. The snow continues through the night without wind. By dawn, the camp appears softer than before, its harsh edges buried beneath clean white accumulation spreading evenly across the shelters, vehicles, fences, and frozen roads. Smoke rises quietly from the stovepipes into pale morning air while footsteps compress new paths over old ones already hidden beneath weeks of snowfall. The entire hillside carries the stillness of a place no longer expecting interruption. Inside the shelters, men wake slowly beneath blankets heavy with trapped heat and damp wool. Some remain lying awake long after the morning bell sounds, staring toward the lantern glow moving faintly across the canvas ceilings. The body adjusts itself to suspension eventually. Sleep grows deeper during storms because storms justify immobility. Nobody expects transport convoys during heavy snow anymore. Nobody anticipates sudden departures before roads reopen. Winter itself has begun participating in the waiting. You watch several soldiers clearing snow from the roofs of the kitchens using shovels and broken planks tied together with wire. The work proceeds methodically but without urgency. Snow slides downward in thick silent sheets beside the walls where it joins piles already frozen hard from previous storms. One man pauses midway through the labor to warm his hands against the stovepipe protruding through the roof before resuming again. No officer supervises the work. That detail matters now. The camp has internalized its own continuation. Near headquarters, a transport truck sits half-buried beside the administration tent with its engine removed entirely for repairs unlikely to finish before spring. Snow covers the exposed chassis. Frost gathers inside the empty cab where papers and ration tins remain scattered across the seats exactly as the driver left them weeks earlier. Several soldiers pass the vehicle daily without really seeing it anymore. Movement abandoned long enough becomes scenery. Inside the communication shelter, the radio operators continue listening through static layered thick by winter weather crossing the mountains. Most transmissions now concern reconstruction priorities, civilian displacement, fuel redistribution, border administration. The language of war has faded from the airwaves almost completely. No more urgent artillery coordinates. No more emergency reinforcements. No more frantic requests for evacuation under fire. Only logistics remain. And the stranded soldiers exist at the very bottom of logistical importance. One operator remarks quietly while adjusting frozen wires that the world now sounds tired rather than dangerous. The observation lingers afterward because everyone nearby understands its truth immediately. Even history itself appears exhausted beyond the perimeter fences. At midday, several officers attempt organizing transport drills after receiving notice that weather conditions may improve temporarily within the week. Engines are started. Equipment inspected. Soldiers assemble near the roads beneath weak winter sunlight breaking briefly through the clouds. For a short while the camp almost resembles its former self again. Commands echo across the snow. Drivers test frozen steering systems. Mechanics crawl beneath trucks tightening chains and checking fuel lines. Yet the atmosphere feels strangely theatrical. The motions remain correct. The emotional connection beneath them has thinned. You notice how slowly the soldiers react when whistles sound. Not disobediently. Simply without instinctive urgency anymore. One private secures supply straps with calm deliberate movements better suited to loading a warehouse than preparing military transport. Nearby, another pauses midway through checking tire pressure to stare at birds crossing above the valley. The officers notice these things too. They say nothing. Because there is no punishment capable of restoring momentum once momentum itself has become psychologically distant. By evening, worsening weather cancels the transport exercises entirely after reports arrive warning of blocked mountain passes farther south. The announcement spreads through the camp with almost no visible disappointment. Several men continue eating supper while hearing the news without even looking up from their bowls. That reaction unsettles the officers more deeply than protest ever could. Earlier in the waiting, cancelled movement plans generated frustration, anger, argument, renewed speculation. Now cancellation simply folds back into routine without resistance. The camp absorbs delay naturally. The stranded condition has become normalized internally. Near the western shelters, a group of soldiers gather after dark around a stove glowing faintly orange beneath hanging blankets used to trap additional heat inside the tent. One man reads aloud from an old railway timetable discovered inside an abandoned station months earlier. The routes no longer function properly. Some cities listed belong to different political sectors entirely now. Yet the men listen carefully all the same while steam rises from mugs held between their hands. The timetable reads almost like mythology. Morning departures. Connections. Arrival times. Movement promised with certainty. One soldier laughs softly when hearing how precisely the trains once ran before the war. Another remarks that civilians probably still complain whenever schedules fall 10 minutes behind. The laughter that follows carries no bitterness exactly, only distance. You stand outside the shelter afterward, watching lantern light flicker faintly through layers of snow gathering along the canvas walls. Beyond the camp perimeter, the frozen valley stretches outward beneath moonlight reflecting across buried roads and silent forests. Somewhere far away, trains likely still cross bridges repaired after the fighting ended. People step off platforms carrying luggage toward homes warmed by electric light and familiar kitchens. But here the soldiers have begun forgetting what uninterrupted movement feels like emotionally. Not physically. Emotionally. The difference matters. A mechanic confesses quietly near the generators later that night that he sometimes struggles now to imagine the actual process of leaving the camp. Not home itself. Only departure. Boarding trains. Crossing checkpoints. Arriving somewhere without returning afterward. The sequence feels strangely abstract in his mind after months spent measuring existence through confined repetition. Several others nearby nod without speaking. They understand. Toward midnight, a sentry walks the northern perimeter beneath falling snow while the camp settles into sleep behind him. His boots follow paths worn hard through repetition. Fence posts rise from the drifts at regular intervals beside the buried road. Beyond them lies open country stretching toward distant rail lines and reorganized borders. Yet the landscape no longer feels connected to movement. Only separation. The sentry pauses briefly to listen. No engines. No trains. Only wind moving softly across the frozen hills. Then he continues walking the perimeter again through snow, already beginning to erase his footprints behind him. Winter entering the mind. The cold changes from environment into condition sometime after the new year. Earlier in the winter, the soldiers still experienced the weather as something moving around them. Snowstorms arrived. Frost settled overnight. Wind crossed the valley carrying ice against canvas walls and exposed skin. The men responded practically. Extra blankets. Longer stove fires. More careful rationing of dry socks and fuel. One pauses repeatedly to flex numb fingers near the stove flame before returning to the same slow repetitive motions. Outside, frost whitens the interior seams of the shelters despite the fires burning through most nights now. The cold has become patient. It no longer attacks suddenly. It settles. You walk between the tents while the camp wakes beneath grey skies carrying no clear boundary between morning and afternoon. Smoke drifts low along the roads because the air remains too heavy for it to rise properly. Men emerge quietly from the shelters with shoulders already rounded inward against temperatures they have stopped discussing aloud. Earlier in the waiting, soldiers compared weather constantly. Storm predictions. Frozen roads. Hopes for spring thaw. Now the cold feels permanent enough that commentary around it has faded. People stop narrating conditions they no longer believe temporary. At the medical tent, the doctor notices increasing complaints difficult to classify officially. Persistent exhaustion. Sleeplessness despite fatigue. Joint pain without visible injury. Men sitting awake through entire nights beside dying stove fires, simply listening to wind move against the camp walls outside. None of these symptoms fit neatly inside military paperwork. The doctor records them anyway. Reduced vitality. Seasonal deterioration. Psychological fatigue. The words feel too small for what he actually observes. One private arrives complaining his hands remain cold even while holding hot tea directly beside the stove. Another says he no longer remembers feeling genuinely warm at all. The doctor checks circulation carefully, though he suspects the deeper issue lies elsewhere entirely. Prolonged suspension alters the body indirectly. The mind stops expecting comfort. Eventually the body follows. Inside headquarters, the officers speak more quietly than ever now, their breath visible above stacks of reports and transport revisions spread across tables cluttered with frozen ink bottles and cooling coffee cups. One clerk wraps cloth around his wrists while typing because the cold entering through the tent seams has inflamed old injuries from the front. Near the western perimeter, a group of soldiers attempt repairing collapsed shelter supports after accumulated snow bends part of the roof inward during the night. The work proceeds slowly beneath falling frost shaken loose from the canvas overhead. One man climbs onto the frame while another braces the supports below using scavenged timber cut from abandoned barns farther down the valley. No one speaks much during the repair. The cold discourages unnecessary language. Even emotions begin freezing inward after enough repetition. At supper, silence settles heavily across the kitchens except for spoons against metal bowls and the low crackling of wet wood burning in the stoves. The soup tastes mostly of salt and boiled root vegetables now that supply variability has narrowed through winter shortages. Earlier in the waiting, meals still carried occasional surprise. Fresh bread, imported coffee, packages from home, seasonal preserves. Now the food has become as repetitive as the days surrounding it. A corporal eating near the stove suddenly stops midway through lifting his spoon and stares toward the steam rising from his bowl. For several seconds he appears far away entirely. Then he resumes eating without explanation. No one nearby asks what interrupted him because such moments have become common throughout the camp. The mind drifts differently in prolonged cold. Thoughts slow. Memory arrives without warning. The present weakens at the edges. You stand near the frozen stream after dusk while several soldiers break ice beneath lantern light to collect water before temperatures fall further overnight. The blows from their axes echo sharply across the valley before fading into snow-covered silence. One man remarks quietly that the stream sounds deeper during winter even though the water level has dropped beneath the ice. Another replies that everything sounds farther away now. The observation lingers afterward. Distance itself has changed shape inside the camp. Home feels farther. Movement feels farther. Even time feels stretched thin beneath the repetition of snow, smoke, frost, and waiting. Back near the shelters, men gather tightly around stoves burning lower each evening as fuel reserves shrink carefully toward spring. Blankets hang across in trances to trap additional heat. Boots dry beside embers glowing dull red beneath ash. One soldier falls asleep sitting upright with a letter still open across his lap while wind rattles softly against the canvas outside. The others leave him there rather than waking him. Sleep has become fragile enough to protect whenever it arrives naturally. Toward midnight, the temperature drops sharply once more. Frost spreads across the lantern glass. Ice thickens along the water barrels. The nights become longer than the clocks suggest. That realization spreads quietly through the camp during the deepest weeks of winter when darkness arrives before supper and remains long after morning bell. The soldiers continue measuring hours officially through watches, schedules, duty rotations, but internally time has begun stretching unevenly beneath the cold. 1 hour beside a failing stove feels endless. Entire weeks vanish afterward without clear memory attached to them. The waiting no longer moves consistently inside the mind. You notice this near the kitchens after midnight where several cooks remain awake preparing bread dough for morning rations beneath lanterns fogged by steam and frost. Their movements unfold slowly, almost underwater, while snow taps softly against the shelter walls outside. One cook pauses repeatedly during the same task as though forgetting briefly what step comes next. Fatigue has settled so deeply through the camp that even routine now requires conscious recovery. No one hurries him. The others simply continue working until his hands begin moving again. Near the medical tent, a nurse walks between shelters carrying a lantern shielded carefully beneath her coat against the wind. She has started memorizing which men wake screaming during the night and which remain silent afterwards, staring into darkness until dawn. Combat nightmares still occur, but less frequently than before. Something quieter has replaced them. Dreams without movement. Dreams where trains never arrive. Dreams where roads continue endlessly through snow without destination. The stranded condition has entered sleep itself. Inside one shelter near the northern fence, several soldiers remain awake long after the stove burns low because none wish to be the first person entering the cold blankets waiting beyond the firelight. They sit wrapped in coats and blankets, listening to ice shift faintly along the tent ropes outside. Conversation moves slowly between fragments of memory and long pauses heavy enough to feel shared. One man tries describing summer rain on apartment windows back home, but cannot remember the exact sound anymore. That frightens him more than he admits aloud. The others understand immediately. Memory requires contrast to remain vivid. The camp provides almost none now beyond varying degrees of cold and repetition. You stand beside the communications shelter where radio operators continue scanning frequencies through static thickened by winter storms moving across the mountains. Occasionally music emerges briefly through the interference before vanishing again. Dance orchestras. News broadcasts. Advertisements spoken with cheerful civilian certainty. The operators rarely adjust the dials quickly anymore when these fragments appear. They listen longer now. Not because the information matters operationally, but because civilian voices remind the camp that warmth still exists somewhere beyond the frozen hills. One operator confesses quietly that he has started imagining entire cities continuing normally beneath electric light while the camp itself feels increasingly temporary in the opposite direction. Not temporary because it will disappear soon, but temporary because it no longer fully belongs to ordinary time. The observation spreads through him slowly while he speaks. Outside headquarters, the officers burn additional fuel despite shortages because paperwork becomes impossible when fingers lose sensation entirely. The interior of the tent smells constantly now of melting snow, damp wool, ink, smoke, and overheated metal from the small stoves running almost without pause. Maps curl inward from the dry heat while frost still gathers simultaneously along the lower canvas seams. The officers sleep less during this stage of winter. Not from urgency. From erosion. One captain begins taking long walks through the camp before dawn wearing no gloves despite the cold severe enough to numb exposed skin within minutes. Several soldiers notice but say nothing. The captain himself may not fully understand why he walks. Perhaps movement reassures him that he is not frozen emotionally alongside everything else surrounding the camp. The soldiers feel similar impulses increasingly often. A mechanic spends nearly an hour each evening pacing beside the buried transport trucks before returning silently to his shelter. Another volunteers repeatedly for perimeter duty simply because walking through snow keeps his thoughts from settling too heavily inward. A cook continues reorganizing kitchen supplies already perfectly arranged because stillness itself has begun feeling dangerous. Winter does this slowly. It turns motion into medicine. Near midday, weak sunlight breaks briefly across the valley for the first time in several days. Men emerge instinctively from the shelters despite the cold, standing beside roads and fences with faces turned toward the pale light as though trying to absorb warmth through memory alone. Steam rises from thawing canvas. Meltwater drips softly from vehicle frames buried beneath ice. For nearly 20 minutes, the camp almost resembles ordinary life again. Then clouds close overhead once more. The emotional drop afterward feels physical. At the frozen stream, A soldier slips while hauling water and remains sitting on the ice longer than necessary, afterwards staring toward the distant hills. Another finally helps him stand without either speaking. The silence between them contains no embarrassment. Only exhaustion too deep for explanation. The cold has simplified emotional expression across the camp. People help each other quietly now. Without commentary. Without performance. You walk near the western shelters after dark, where smoke drifts low through lantern light while men gather close beside stoves burning weaker each night. Fuel reserves continue shrinking despite careful rationing. Several tents now combine sleeping quarters to conserve heat. Personal space has narrowed steadily through winter until entire groups sleep nearly shoulder to shoulder beneath layered blankets and hanging coats used as insulation. No one complains much anymore. The body adapts to compression when alternatives disappear. One soldier reads aloud from an old novel missing entire sections while the others listen with eyes closed beside the stove. The missing pages barely matter now. Everyone inside the shelter understands what stories are for during winters like this. Not resolution. Not suspense. Continuation. A voice moving steadily through darkness. Toward midnight, the wind rises hard enough to shake frost loose from the shelter roofs and send snow spiraling across the camp roads once more. Sentries lower their heads against the weather while lanterns flicker behind thickening layers of ice gathering along the glass. Somewhere beyond the mountains, trains still move. Governments still negotiate. Cities still rebuild beneath electric lights and functioning clocks. But here inside the stranded camp, winter has entered the soldiers completely now. Into their routines. Into their sleep. Into memory itself. And increasingly, into the quiet spaces where movement once felt natural enough to imagine without effort. Spring arriving unevenly. Not through warmth exactly, but through sound. Water appears first beneath the camp before anyone sees it directly. Ice shifts underneath packed snow with low cracking noises during the night. Dripping begins along the shelter ropes after midday sunlight lingers slightly longer across the valley. Mud returns in narrow dark strips beside the roads where wagon wheels and boots cut through weakening frost. The soldiers notice these changes cautiously, almost suspiciously, as though spring itself might still reverse course without warning. After so many months of winter, movement feels dangerous to trust. You stand near the kitchens one morning listening to meltwater strike empty fuel drums in slow irregular rhythms while smoke rises thinner now through softer air. The cooks work with tent flaps partially open for the first time in weeks. Steam drifts outward carrying the smell of boiled coffee and damp earth newly exposed beneath retreating snowbanks. One man pauses during breakfast distribution simply to stare at grass emerging beside the southern fence. The color unsettles him briefly. Green feels unfamiliar here now. Across the camp, the soldiers begin shedding layers gradually without fully believing the cold has loosened its hold. Scarves disappear first. Then extra gloves during daylight hours. Blankets hanging across shelter entrances are rolled aside temporarily each afternoon before returning again at night when temperatures still collapse after sunset. Spring arrives unevenly inside stranded places. The weather changes faster than the mind does. Near the vehicle sheds, mechanics uncover trucks buried almost entirely through winter accumulation. Canvas tarps stiffened by frost are peeled away slowly beneath pale sunlight while meltwater drips from exposed metal surfaces darkened by rust and months of disuse. Several engines are tested for the first time since deep winter closed the roads completely. The sounds echo strangely through the valley, coughing ignition, grinding gears, exhaust smoke rising into moving air no longer trapped beneath cold pressure. The entire camp listens when engines start now. Not with excitement exactly. more with distant recognition. Like hearing a language remembered imperfectly after long absence. Inside headquarters, maps return to the tables more frequently as reports arrive describing reopened crossings farther south and partial railway repairs near the river sectors. The officers speak with slightly more energy than during winter, though caution still surrounds every conversation involving movement. Too many previous hopes dissolved beneath weather, bureaucracy, or shifting political boundaries for confidence to recover quickly. One captain traces possible transport routes across the map using his finger while snowmelt drips steadily from the tent roof nearby. The gesture looks almost ceremonial. Outside, work details increase immediately with the thaw. Roads must be reinforced before the mud deepens further. Drainage ditches reopened. Rotting shelter supports replaced before spring storms arrive. Men labor through softening ground carrying timber, gravel, and salvaged boards beneath skies shifting constantly between pale sunlight and cold rain. The physical exhaustion feels different now. Winter exhausted the soldiers inwardly. Spring exhausts them through reawakening. You watch several men repairing the northern road where frozen ruts have collapsed into deep mud channels capable of trapping entire vehicles. They work knee-deep in wet earth while meltwater runs through the ditches beside them carrying fragments of straw, cigarette butts, and ashes accumulated beneath the snow all winter. One soldier remarks quietly that the camp is surfacing like a battlefield after thaw. The observation lingers. Spring reveals what winter concealed. Near the medical tent, illness patterns begin changing too. Fewer frost injuries. More respiratory infections carried through damp air and overcrowded shelters saturated from months of trapped moisture. The doctor notices morale improving slightly during daylight hours while worsening unexpectedly after dark when the returning sounds of moving water and distant birds create emotional contrasts too sharp for some men to tolerate comfortably. Hope returning unevenly can wound people almost as deeply as hopelessness. One private breaks down quietly after receiving transport rumors later proven false again because he allowed himself, briefly, to imagine departure physically for the first time in months. The medic treating him afterward remarks that prolonged waiting teaches people to fear expectation itself. The camp understands this instinctively now. Near dusk, several soldiers gather beside the frozen stream now partially reopened through the ice. Water moves visibly again between broken white shelves drifting slowly downstream. The men stand silently watching the current carry branches and thawed debris beneath fading sunlight. Movement exists in the valley once more. The sight feels strangely emotional. One soldier kneels near the bank and submerges both hands into the water despite its coldness. Another removes his cap simply to feel wind moving freely through his hair again after months beneath wool and frost. Small gestures. Yet they carry the quiet intensity of men reacquainting themselves with the possibility of seasons continuing. Back near the shelters, changes appear quickly now that snow no longer covers everything equally. Rust blooms visibly across neglected equipment. Canvas tents reveal mold stains hidden beneath winter frost. Wooden structures sag where moisture weakened them unseen. The camp itself looks older in spring light, more temporary, and more permanent simultaneously. You walk beside the southern road while a convoy attempts departure after receiving conditional authorization to proceed toward reopened rail junctions beyond the mountains. The trucks struggle through mud, replacing the snowbanks almost immediately. Wheels spin. Chains snap. Men push from behind while engines roar against the softened earth. The camp gathers quietly to watch. Not cheering. Not celebrating. Only observing. One vehicle becomes trapped so deeply that unloading cargo becomes necessary before movement can continue. The delay stretches through hours while rain begins falling lightly across the valley. Eventually the convoy departs anyway, disappearing southward between hills streaked with thawing snow and exposed black earth. The soldiers continue watching long after the engines vanish. Because departure no longer looks simple. Movement itself appears exhausted now. Toward evening, birds return visibly to the valley in larger numbers than before. Their calls drift above the camp while smoke rises through damp spring air carrying the smell of mud, wet timber, diesel fuel, and thawed earth long buried beneath ice. The season has changed. The camp has not fully changed with it yet. That difference hangs quietly over everything now, the road softening, the water moving, the engines starting again, while the stranded soldiers remain uncertain whether the thaw truly means return or merely another form of waiting beneath different weather. Rain replaces snow gradually enough that many soldiers continue waking during the night expecting silence only to hear water moving instead. Dripping from shelter ropes. Running beneath floorboards. Sliding through the ditches reopened along the roads. The sounds feel restless after winter's heavy stillness. Some men sleep worse now despite the warmer air because the camp itself has begun shifting again beneath them. Frozen certainty has dissolved into motion without direction. Mud replaces ice. Fog replaces snowfall. The waiting continues, but no longer under the clean suspension winter imposed. Spring complicates stillness. You stand beside the northern road before dawn watching soldiers spread gravel across deep mud channels carved by the first departing convoys. Rain drifts sideways through weak lantern light while boots sink heavily into ground softened by thaw. The men work with mechanical patience, shoveling stone into ruts that seem to refill with water almost immediately afterward. One mechanic remarks quietly that winter buried the roads. Spring reveals how damaged they truly became underneath. The observation applies to more than the roads. Across the camp, routines once stabilized by cold weather begin loosening unpredictably. Men spend longer periods outdoors now simply because the shelters smell increasingly of damp canvas, mold, smoke, and accumulated winter fatigue. Groups gather beside the stream during off-duty hours watching water move beneath broken ice sheets drifting slowly downstream. Others walk the perimeter roads without clear purpose beyond movement itself. The body remembers motion before the mind fully trusts it. Near headquarters, officers hold longer meetings regarding phased departures, revised transport priorities, and the gradual dissolution of several nearby camps farther south. New maps appear marked with reopening rail corridors and provisional civilian transit routes. Yet every discussion remains surrounded by uncertainty. Fuel shortages continue. Political boundaries shift unexpectedly. Refugee traffic overwhelms functioning rail systems. Entire regions remain administratively tangled beyond clear authority. The machinery of return has awakened. But unevenly. You watch a captain reading updated transport lists beneath grey afternoon light while rainwater drips steadily from the tent seams behind him. Several names from the camp finally appear under confirmed departure classifications. The captain studies the list carefully before posting it near the administration tables where soldiers gather almost immediately despite trying not to appear eager. Hope returns cautiously now. Like injured animals approaching open ground. One soldier reads the list 3 times before understanding his own name is truly there. Another stares silently at the paper for nearly a minute after discovering his transfer delayed again without explanation. Nearby, several men pretend indifference while watching others react. The emotional atmosphere surrounding departure has become too fragile for open celebration. Everyone understands that movement for some still means waiting for others. At the kitchens, conversation changes shape subtly during these weeks of thaw. Men speak less often about surviving the camp and more frequently about conditions beyond it. Rail stations. Occupation checkpoints. Food shortages in cities farther west. Rumors of entire towns rebuilt already while others remain piles of brick and twisted metal. The outside world begins re-entering the imagination unevenly. One soldier admits quietly he no longer knows whether home itself still resembles the place he left. No one reassures him falsely. Near the western shelters, several tents are dismantled for the first time since winter began after transport groups finally depart southward through the reopened roads. The empty spaces left behind feel stranger than expected. Flattened ground. Ash circles from old stove fires. Rope marks in softened earth. Soldiers passing the cleared areas glance toward them instinctively as though expecting the shelters still to stand there. The camp has existed long enough for absence itself to become visible. You walk beside a departing convoy one rainy morning while trucks loaded with equipment and exhausted soldiers struggle slowly through mud stretching toward the southern valley roads. The men riding inside appear subdued rather than relieved. Some watch the camp receding behind them through rain-streaked windows without expression. Others avoid looking backward entirely. Leaving after prolonged suspension feels emotionally different than imagined departure during the early months. There is less triumph, more disorientation. One private standing beside the road after the convoy passes remarks softly that the men leaving look almost like refugees from the camp rather than soldiers returning home. The statement unsettles those nearby because it feels true. The stranded condition has altered them all more deeply than visible routine could reveal. Inside headquarters after dusk, the officers finally begin discussing dissolution timelines openly. Supply inventories shrink intentionally now rather than through scarcity alone. Additional shelters are marked for dismantling. Administrative records prepare for transfer toward regional archives farther west. The camp itself has entered transition. Yet emotionally, many soldiers remain trapped several seasons behind reality. Winter still lives inside parts of them. A medic notices increasing nervous tension among men scheduled for departure within days. Sleeplessness returns. Appetite weakens. Some repeatedly reorganize equipment already packed carefully the night before. Others wander the camp alone after dark, revisiting familiar roads, stove fires, workshops, stream crossings. The camp became a form of existence. Leaving it now requires another transformation. Near midnight, rain falls steadily across the valley while lanterns glow behind fewer shelters than before. Smoke drifts low through wet spring air, carrying the smells of thawed earth and soaked timber replacing winter frost. Somewhere beyond the perimeter, frogs begin calling from flooded fields reopened by meltwater. The sound startles several soldiers awake. Nature itself is moving forward again. Back near the northern fence, a sentry pauses while watching water flow through drainage channels dug months earlier beneath frozen ground. The same roads buried by snow now dissolve slowly into mud beneath warmer rain. The valley changes daily now. Grass spreads wider each morning. Birds gather along the stream banks. Distant villages leave windows open briefly during afternoon sunlight. Movement surrounds the camp from every direction at last. Yet inside many of the soldiers, stillness remains lodged deeply beneath the thaw. Toward dawn, another convoy prepares quietly for departure while mechanics warm engines beside drifting rain and low clouds hanging over the hills. Men load crates, fold blankets, secure fuel drums. The camp watches with tired silence from muddy roads and shelter entrances. No one asks anymore whether movement has finally returned. Movement has returned. The deeper question now is whether the stranded soldiers themselves still remember fully how to follow it. Returning without arrival. The first men to leave do not return to the camp. But news of them does. Fragments arrive through letters, redirected reports, overheard conversations between transport crews passing north and south through the valley roads. The stories carry no single shape. One soldier reaches his hometown only to discover the apartment building replaced by rubble and temporary housing. Another spends weeks moving between processing stations because his identification papers no longer match revised civilian registries. A third arrives home successfully yet writes afterward that he barely recognizes his own street beneath reconstruction and unfamiliar silence. The camp listens carefully whenever these fragments appear. Not because the stories are dramatic, because they feel incomplete. Return itself has become another form of waiting. You stand near the kitchens while rain taps softly against the shelter roofs and a corporal reads aloud portions of a letter received from a former mechanic who departed with one of the early spring convoys. The mechanic describes civilian crowds moving through train stations with hurried purpose that now feels almost aggressive after months inside the slowed rhythms of the camp. He writes about struggling to sleep indoors where rooms remain too quiet without wind against canvas and distant engines through the night. Several soldiers listening nearby lower their eyes toward their bowls afterward. The details disturb them more than outright tragedy would. Because the letter confirms something many already fear privately. Leaving the camp may not immediately end the stranded condition. Near headquarters, transport schedules accelerate unevenly as thawed roads reopen across wider regions. Entire sections of the encampment begin dissolving now. Supply depots emptied. Shelter rows dismantled. Storage pits filled. Yet despite this visible movement, the emotional atmosphere grows stranger rather than lighter. The camp no longer feels frozen in place exactly. It feels suspended during dismantling, like a stage being removed while the actors still linger upon it uncertain where to stand afterward. One lieutenant supervising departures notices soldiers repeatedly returning to abandoned sections of camp even after their own equipment has already been packed. Men sit beside extinguished stove pits or walk slowly along roads no longer assigned to patrol. A few help dismantle shelters where they themselves slept all winter despite no longer being ordered to do so. The habits of waiting do not dissolve quickly. You walk beside the western perimeter where only a handful of tents remain standing beneath damp spring skies carrying the smell of thawed mud and wet grass. The ground beneath the missing shelters appears pale where sunlight failed to reach during winter. Rusted nails, cigarette butts, scraps of cloth, and broken ration tins surface from the mud as though the camp itself is shedding memory physically into the open air. Several soldiers pause while crossing these empty spaces. Not from nostalgia exactly. More from disorientation. The camp occupied so much emotional space for so long that its gradual disappearance feels almost physically unstable. Inside the medical tent, the doctor notices symptoms changing again among departing men. Not exhaustion now. Restlessness. Sudden bursts of nervous energy followed by silence. One soldier scheduled for transport spends an entire afternoon repeatedly unpacking and repacking the same duffel bag until a medic quietly tells him to stop for a while and rest. Another confesses privately that he no longer remembers how civilians behave during ordinary conversation. The doctor writes none of this into official reports. There are no categories for it. At dusk, a train whistle echoes through the valley clearly enough for the entire camp to hear. The sound feels different now that departure has become physically possible again. During winter, trains symbolized distant movement belonging to others. Now they represent an approaching threshold many soldiers are no longer emotionally prepared to cross cleanly. One sentry standing near the northern road remarks softly that the camp taught them how to wait, but not how to stop waiting. No one nearby replies. Near the stream, Several departing soldiers gather quietly after evening meal beside water now fully released from winter ice. The current moves steadily between muddy banks carrying branches, scraps of timber, and fragments of snow melt toward valleys beyond visibility. One man skips a stone across the water almost absently while another studies the hills where the last snow still clings in pale streaks along shaded ridges. Their conversation moves slowly around practical concerns. Housing, food shortages, finding work, family members not yet located. Yet beneath every topic lies a quieter uncertainty difficult to name directly. Who exactly returns after prolonged suspension? The camp changed the soldiers unevenly. Some became quieter, some harder, some strangely detached from urgency itself. Winter compressed their worlds into stove heat, paperwork, mud, lantern light, and repeated roads walked until memory itself narrowed around routine. Now the world beyond the valley is widening again faster than many can follow comfortably. You stand beside the southern road one rainy morning while another convoy prepares departure beneath weak grey light. Trucks idle through drifting exhaust while soldiers load remaining equipment with subdued efficiency. The camp behind them looks smaller now. Fewer shelters. Wider gaps between structures. Less smoke rising into the morning air. The dismantling has become visible from every direction. Yet as the convoy begins moving, several men riding inside continue turning to look backward toward the camp despite the rain striking their faces through open canvas flaps. The sight carries no romance. Only attachment formed through endurance. One private remaining behind watches the convoy disappear down the muddy road before remarking quietly that the camp no longer feels temporary enough to leave casually. The statement lingers because everyone nearby understands its truth immediately. Temporary places are forgotten easily. The stranded camp survived too long for that. Inside headquarters after dark, the officers begin burning archived paperwork no longer required for transport processing. Flames curl through stacks of duplicated forms while smoke gathers beneath the tent ceiling carrying the smell of ink, damp paper, and old administrative exhaustion. One captain watches transport manifests blacken slowly in the stove fire and remarks that the camp may vanish before anyone fully understands what happened inside it. The major beside him nods without speaking. Outside, rain falls steadily across muddy roads leading outward through the valley toward reorganized cities and uncertain homes. Lanterns glow behind the remaining shelters while fewer voices drift through the night air than before. Somewhere beyond the hills, trains continue carrying former soldiers toward civilian lives already reshaped without them. And here inside the dissolving camp, the men preparing to leave begin realizing something difficult. Movement has returned. Arrival has not. The camp grows quieter with each departure, though not emptier in the way anyone expected. The remaining shelters now stand farther apart across the hillside where entire rows have already been dismantled and carted away towards storage depots or burned for fuel. Wind moves more freely through the open spaces left behind. Muddy paths that once carried constant foot traffic now end abruptly in patches of flattened earth and abandoned stove pits slowly filling with rainwater. The silence feels exposed. Winter silence belonged to snow. This newer silence belongs to absence. You walk near the former western sleeping sector where only broken crate boards and rusted wire remain scattered through wet grass beginning to push upward through the mud. Several soldiers cross the area daily despite no duties requiring them there anymore. One pauses occasionally beside the outline where his shelter once stood as though trying to remember something not fully connected to the physical place itself. The camp survives most strongly now through habit. At the kitchens, the meal lines shorten visibly each week. Fewer bowls. Fewer voices. Less steam rising from the kettles during morning distribution. Yet the routines continue almost unchanged despite the reduced numbers. The cooks still wake before dawn. Fires still lit carefully against damp spring air. Bread still cut into equal portions even when excess remains afterward. Structure persists beyond necessity because abandoning it completely would make the dissolving feel too sudden. One cook admits quietly while scrubbing soot from a kettle that he no longer knows whether he misses home more or simply fears losing the camp's predictability. The confession surprises him while speaking it aloud. Nearby, another soldier nods slowly without lifting his eyes from the table. Predictability became a form of shelter here. Even suffering repeated long enough acquires familiar edges. Near headquarters, transport officers spend entire afternoons reorganizing departure schedules as reopened rail lines farther south become overwhelmed by civilians, refugees, released prisoners, labor detachments, and returning soldiers all moving simultaneously across damaged infrastructure. Men ready to leave wait again beside packed equipment because trains arrive full or permissions expire unexpectedly at checkpoints. The stranded condition follows them outward. One convoy returns to camp after 2 days on the road when flooding destroys a temporary bridge farther south. The soldiers climbing back from the trucks carry expressions too exhausted even for disappointment. Several simply retrieve their old blankets and resume previous sleeping spaces without speaking. No one asks questions. The camp has learned not to wound returning hope unnecessarily. You stand beside the administration tent while rain drips steadily from the roof seams and watch a corporal sorting letters redirected from dissolved camps across the region. Some envelopes arrive months late carrying news already outdated before delivery. One man receives word that his family relocated during winter to another city entirely. Another learns his workplace no longer exists. A third discovers his younger brother died nearly a year earlier during final fighting farther east. The letters arrive softly. That softness makes them harder to absorb. Inside the medical tent, the doctor notices that men preparing for departure increasingly seek treatment for minor ailments previously ignored during winter. Tooth pain, persistent coughs, insomnia, stomach problems. Conditions tolerated easily while survival itself dominated daily life now resurface once return becomes imaginable. The body senses transition before the mind organizes it fully. One departing mechanic asks the doctor whether difficulty imagining civilian routine again qualifies as illness. The doctor hesitates before answering because honesty feels cruel and false reassurance feels worse. Eventually he says only, "You'll remember slowly." Neither man appears convinced. At dusk, several soldiers gather beside the stream where spring runoff now moves fast enough to carry entire branches downstream through the valley. The water sounds louder than during winter, less restrained. Birds gather along the muddy banks. Grass spreads visibly wider each week across slopes that months earlier disappeared beneath snow and smoke. Nature has resumed proportion. The soldiers have not. One man describes arriving briefly in a rebuilt town during transport delays farther south before being redirected again. He says the civilian crowds unsettled him most. People walking quickly, arguing over ordinary purchases, laughing loudly in cafes while trains moved through functioning stations outside. They looked awake, he says quietly. No one nearby speaks afterward. The camp understands what he means immediately. Prolonged waiting dulls certain internal movements difficult to restore quickly. Civilian urgency now appears almost theatrical to men trained by repetition and suspension into slower emotional rhythms. You walk near the northern perimeter after dark where fewer sentries patrol now that most surrounding sectors have stabilized. The fences remain standing, though several sections lean crooked where thaw weakened the posts. Beyond them, The roads stretch through green hills carrying civilian traffic again alongside military convoys. Bicycles appear occasionally now. Farm wagons. Children walking beside reopened fields. The outside world has resumed continuity. The camp still exists between states. Inside headquarters, only a fraction of the original staff remains. Entire tables once buried beneath paperwork now stand empty except for wax stains and forgotten pencils. The Major spends evenings reviewing final transfer rosters beneath lantern light while rain taps softly against the canvas overhead. He looks smaller somehow. Not physically. Administratively. The machinery surrounding the camp no longer requires command presence with the same intensity now that dissolution approaches. The officers who spent winter holding stillness together find themselves slowly becoming unnecessary alongside the camp itself. That realization settles heavily. One captain begins burning old operational maps after midnight because storage transport remains limited. Front lines curl black through the stove flames. Supply corridors vanish into ash. Entire campaigns disappear silently beneath firelight while the remaining officers sit nearby too tired to speak much. History reduces strangely after prolonged waiting. Not into victories. Into paperwork and smoke. Near dawn, another convoy finally departs successfully through clearing weather toward functioning rail depots beyond the southern mountains. The remaining soldiers watch quietly from muddy roads and shelter entrances while engines fade into the distance beneath pale spring light. No cheering follows. Only observation. The camp has survived too long for dramatic emotion now. As morning settles across the hillside, you realize how little of the original encampment remains visible. Fewer tents. Fewer vehicles. Fewer voices drifting through damp air carrying the smell of rain and thawed earth. Yet emotionally, the stranded condition still lingers everywhere. In the slow movements, the careful silences, the way men continue waiting even after departure schedules finally begin moving around them. Because after enough suspension, people do not simply return. They emerge gradually. And many have not yet fully arrived back inside themselves. Roads leading into other lives. By early summer, the camp exists mostly as memory surrounded by dismantling. Only a handful of shelters remain standing across the hillside now. The kitchens operate from reduced fires. Supply depots stand nearly empty except for crates awaiting final transport allocation. Grass grows through roads packed hard by thousands of boots during winter. Wildflowers appear beside drainage ditches once filled with snow and frozen mud. The valley itself seems impatient to reclaim the land beneath the camp. Nature continues without ceremony. The soldiers notice this more than anyone else. You walk along the southern road one morning beneath pale sunlight warming the hills for the first time without resistance from frost or rain. Birds move freely through the open spaces where tents once crowded together shoulder to shoulder beneath winter smoke. The stream beside the western perimeter runs clear now, carrying no trace of ice at all. The camp survived long enough to witness the full return of seasons. That realization settles heavily over the remaining men. Near the kitchens, a corporal dismantles shelving built during autumn from ammunition crates and salvaged timber. His hands move carefully while removing nails bent through months of use. Another soldier folds blankets no longer needed for cold nights and ties them into transport bundles stacked beside the road. The work resembles departure physically. Emotionally, it resembles excavation. Each dismantled object exposes how deeply the stranded condition entered daily life. A mechanic pauses beside a truck finally restored to working order after months buried beneath snow and mud. He runs one hand slowly across the repaired engine housing before climbing into the cab. The vehicle starts immediately now. Fuel lines clear. Tires replaced. Chains removed for summer roads. Yet he sits motionless behind the wheel for several seconds before driving. Movement still requires emotional permission. Inside headquarters, only the major, 2 clerks, and a transport officer remain permanently assigned to the camp. Most of the maps have been removed from the walls. Filing tables stand empty except for final rosters awaiting archive transfer. Lantern hooks remain hanging from tent poles above floorboards permanently stained by melted snow, ink, coffee, and months of exhausted conversation. The headquarters tent feels larger now without constant administrative pressure filling it. And strangely lonelier. You watch the major reviewing final departure manifests beneath open canvas flaps while warm air moves through the tent carrying the smell of wet grass and diesel fuel from the departing convoys outside. During winter, he rarely looked beyond the paperwork long enough to notice weather at all. Now he pauses often, listening to birds moving through the valley or engines fading southward through the hills. The silence after each departure has changed. Earlier, silence meant waiting continuing. Now it means endings accumulating. Near the former medical sector, several soldiers prepare to leave together after sharing the same shelter through most of winter. They move around one another with quiet familiarity while packing remaining equipment into duffel bags and transport crates. One folds another man's blanket automatically without being asked. Another checks fuel coupons and identity papers for the entire group before departure. The camp created temporary forms of family through repetition and endurance. Leaving now threatens those structures too. One soldier admits quietly while tightening straps on his pack that he knows the names of the men beside him more clearly than the streets waiting back home. No one nearby dismisses the statement as exaggeration. Months of suspension reorganize intimacy strangely. You stand beside the northern fence where posts installed during autumn now lean crooked beneath summer weeds and softened earth. Beyond them, civilian traffic moves steadily along reopened valley roads. Farm wagons, repair crews, bicycles, children walking beside fields returned gradually to cultivation after the war. The ordinary world has resumed motion completely. The remaining soldiers still move more slowly through it. Near dusk, a transport train finally arrives at the southern junction specifically assigned for final evacuation of the remaining camp sectors. The news spreads quietly rather than explosively. Men gather their belongings with practiced restraint developed through too many previous delays and cancellations. Equipment loads are checked repeatedly. Papers inspected again. Departure orders folded carefully inside jackets already too warm for summer weather but emotionally difficult to stop wearing. The uniforms themselves have become transitional objects. Half military, half memory. At the stream, several departing soldiers wash their faces before leaving though proper facilities exist near the transport station farther south. The gesture feels ceremonial without anyone naming it as such. One man fills a canteen slowly while staring into the moving water. Another sits silently on the bank for nearly 20 minutes after finishing his preparations. No one rushes him. The camp understands lingering. You walk beside the final convoy descending the muddy road toward the valley station beneath fading evening light. The trucks move more smoothly now that roads have dried under weeks of summer weather, yet the pace remains cautious. Soldiers riding in the backs of the vehicles speak little while fields and villages pass beyond the canvas flaps. Several continue turning to look behind them toward the hills where the camp once stood more fully. Soon almost nothing visible will remain there. No fences. No shelters. No smoke. Only flattened grass and fragments buried beneath soil slowly recovering from occupation. At the rail station, Civilian crowds move alongside military departures beneath repaired signals and partially restored platforms. The station feels too loud after the camp. Voices overlap. Children run between luggage carts. Vendors sell coffee beside patched brick walls still marked by shell damage. Trains arrive and depart according to schedules posted openly for everyone to see. The soldiers entering this environment appear cautious, almost overstimulated. One private flinches visibly when a train whistle sounds nearby at full volume after months of hearing them only distantly through winter valleys. Another stares at civilian passengers arguing impatiently over seating assignments with open disbelief. Urgency has become foreign. As darkness settles, the departing soldiers board transport cars carrying them outward through territories reconstructed unevenly around the absence left by war. Some sit quietly beside windows watching the valley recede. Others close their eyes immediately despite the noise surrounding them. A few unfold letters or photographs preserved carefully throughout the waiting. The train begins moving. Not ceremonially. Simply because schedules require movement now. And slowly, almost uncertainly, the stranded soldiers begin traveling toward lives that continued reshaping themselves while the camp held them still between two different worlds. The train moves south through landscapes already forgetting war unevenly. Fields reopen beside villages still carrying broken roofs. Laundry hangs from windows repaired with mismatched timber and patched glass. Children wave at passing rail cars near crossings rebuilt only partially after winter floods. In some valleys, factories release smoke again above rivers cleared of collapsed bridges and abandoned military debris. In others, entire districts remain hollow beneath weeds and brick dust. The soldiers watch quietly through the windows. Movement surrounds them now. Yet many still feel internally stationary. Inside the transport cars, the atmosphere differs completely from the camp despite carrying the same men. Civilian passengers share compartments beside former soldiers without fully understanding the invisible distances between them. Vendors move through the aisles selling bread, coffee, newspapers, cigarettes. Conversations rise and fall rapidly around schedules, shortages, work permits, housing assignments, reunions planned at stations farther west. The speed of ordinary life feels exhausting. One former mechanic spends nearly an hour staring at a woman arguing impatiently over luggage storage while her husband apologizes to strangers nearby. The mechanic later admits quietly he had forgotten people once possessed energy for inconveniences so small. The camp simplified emotional proportion. Now the world overwhelms him with unnecessary urgency. You sit beside the window watching rain move across distant farmland while the soldiers settle unevenly into civilian motion around them. Some adapt quickly. One corporal begins speaking comfortably with railway workers about repaired infrastructure farther south. Another laughs for the first time in months while sharing cigarettes with passengers from a neighboring compartment. Others withdraw deeper inward. A private who survived the entire winter near the northern fence spends most of the journey holding his packed duffel between both hands as though afraid someone might take it if he loosens his grip. Another repeatedly checks his transport papers despite no inspections occurring anymore. Habits formed during prolonged suspension continue moving through the body long after their necessity fades. At one station stop, civilians crowd the platform beneath restored electric lamps while soldiers step cautiously into the noise and steam drifting beneath the roofed platforms. Coffee stalls operate beside walls still marked by shrapnel. Porters move luggage carts between families embracing after separation. Train whistles echo sharply through the station hall. The soldiers move carefully among all this movement. Like men walking through someone else's dream. One former artilleryman freezes briefly after hearing dance music spill from a nearby cafe where civilians sit drinking beneath open windows despite evening rain. The music unsettles him more deeply than combat memories now. Not because it is unpleasant. Because it belongs entirely to continuity. The world resumed while the camp remained suspended. That difference cannot be crossed immediately through transport alone. Near midnight, several soldiers sleep uneasily against train windows while dark countryside moves beyond the glass in blurred stretches of rain and distant lights. Others remain awake despite exhaustion, watching towns pass through the darkness one after another. Factory chimneys, church towers, bridges repaired temporarily with military steel. Apartment blocks missing entire sections beside streets already crowded again with bicycles and market carts. Civilization has resumed imperfectly. But it has resumed. The stranded soldiers now face a quieter challenge. Re-entering it. You watch one lieutenant remove his wedding ring from a chain around his neck before sliding it back onto his finger for the first time since autumn. The gesture appears awkward, almost unfamiliar physically. Beside him, another soldier studies his reflection in the dark train window and seems briefly startled by the older face looking back. The camp preserved people. It also aged them invisibly. Toward dawn, the train reaches one of the larger reconstructed cities along the route westward. Smoke rises above factories already operating before sunrise. Trams move through wet streets carrying workers beneath electric wires repaired after months of disruption. Crowds fill the platforms with purposeful civilian motion. The soldiers disembarking there step downward slowly into lives already underway without them. One man stands motionless beside the platform for nearly a full minute after the train leaves, surrounded by rushing strangers carrying briefcases and market bags through morning rain. He looks not lost exactly, only unanchored. At another station farther south, a former cook reunites quietly with his sister near a damaged terminal wall covered in reconstruction notices and missing person announcements. Their embrace lasts only seconds before both step apart awkwardly, suddenly uncertain how much time has actually passed between them emotionally. The sister speaks quickly about housing shortages, ration cards, neighbors who disappeared during the war. The cook listens carefully while carrying his duffel as though still awaiting further transport instructions afterward. The stranded condition does not dissolve during reunion. It lingers beneath conversation. You continue southward with the remaining soldiers through landscapes growing warmer and more crowded each day. Summer fields spread outward beneath sunlight, replacing the endless winter skies of the camp. Markets reopen beneath patched awnings. Rivers carry barges again beneath repaired bridges. The world rebuilds itself through motion everywhere the train passes. Yet inside many of the former soldiers, waiting still survives. One mechanic admits quietly during the journey that he keeps expecting someone to announce another delay. Another reassignment. Another temporary encampment farther along the route. The idea of arriving permanently somewhere now feels less believable than continued transit. Suspension trained them too well. Near evening, the train finally empties almost completely as the last groups depart towards scattered destinations across countries still reorganizing themselves after catastrophe. Remaining luggage racks stand bare. Mud tracked from the camp has dried and cracked across the floorboards beneath civilian dust and newspaper scraps. Silence settles softly through the nearly empty compartment. You realize then that the stranded army has not truly ended. It has dispersed into apartments, factories, farms, rail stations, marriage beds, cafes, offices, into lives expected to resume naturally after interruption. But interruption lasting too long changes the shape of return itself. As darkness falls outside the moving train, the final remaining soldiers stare quietly through windows reflecting older faces above landscapes slowly recovering beneath summer light. Somewhere behind them now, the camp dissolves completely into grass, mud, smoke stains, buried nails, and memory. The roads finally moved again. The trains finally came. Yet many of the men traveling home still carry winter inside them, listening unconsciously for distant engines, waiting for further instructions, uncertain whether they have truly left the stranded world behind or merely carried it silently into other lives. The hills forget slowly. By autumn, almost nothing remains visible on the hillside where the camp once stood. Grass has reclaimed most of the roads first. The deep ruts carved by military trucks during the winter months soften beneath rain and root growth until they resemble ordinary uneven ground again. Wildflowers spread through the spaces where tents once crowded shoulder to shoulder beneath smoke and frost. The stream near the western perimeter runs quietly between banks no longer lined with soldiers breaking ice before dawn. Only certain traces resist disappearance. Rusted wire buried beneath soil. Charred stones from old stove fires. Fragments of bottles and ration tins surfacing after heavy rain. A child from a nearby village later discovers a military button while walking through tall grass where headquarters once stood. He carries it home without understanding fully what the object belonged to before the valley returned to silence. The land does not erase history quickly. It absorbs it gradually. You stand upon the hillside now beneath pale evening light while wind moves softly across fields restored after seasons of interruption. Birds pass overhead in slow drifting formations toward the south. Far below, trains continue crossing the valley with regular certainty once more, their whistles no longer strange against the mountains. Civilian roads carry bicycles, farm wagons, buses, repair crews. Ordinary movement resumed through repetition strong enough to outlast catastrophe. The camp survived less than a year. Yet for the men stranded inside it, time behaved differently there. Winter stretched. Silence deepened. Movement became abstract. The soldiers entered the camp believing they were waiting briefly after war. Instead they discovered a quieter territory existing between identities, where armies remained intact physically while dissolving inwardly through repetition, weather, bureaucracy, and delayed return. No battle marked the deepest wounds there. No final assault. No dramatic defeat. Only prolonged suspension. The slow erosion of certainty beneath smoke, mud, lantern light, paperwork, and roads that no longer advanced. Some of the men eventually rebuilt ordinary lives. They found work in factories reopened after reconstruction. Married. Raised children who never saw the frozen camps or smelled damp canvas darkened by winter smoke. Others carried the stranded condition quietly through decades afterward. Sleeping poorly during storms. Pausing whenever distant train whistles crossed valleys at night. Feeling unexpectedly uneasy inside crowded stations or administrative offices where endless lines formed beneath flickering lights. Many never explained these feelings fully. The world understood combat more easily than waiting. Yet waiting changed them profoundly. Because the camp taught a difficult lesson history rarely describes clearly. Human beings can survive enormous hardship when movement continues. Even fear becomes manageable when direction exists. But prolonged stillness inside uncertainty alters people differently. It slows the mind, narrows expectation, teaches caution toward hope itself. And once learned deeply enough, those habits travel home beside you. The officers remembered this too. Long after the camp vanished, some still woke before dawn instinctively expecting transport reports, weather delays, revised manifests requiring signatures before movement could continue. Clerks carried dreams filled with unfinished paperwork and endless administrative corridors stretching through buildings without exits. Mechanics repaired civilian engines years later while remembering trucks buried beneath snow waiting for roads that never opened in time. The stranded army dispersed physically. Its rhythms survived invisibly afterward. Even the valley carried memory for a while. Villagers spoke quietly about the winter when thousands of soldiers waited in the hills while smoke hung low across the snow and engines started each morning without going anywhere. Farmers plowing certain fields occasionally uncovered rusted tools or collapsed drainage trenches hidden beneath earth and grass. Elderly residents later recalled hearing distant harmonica music drifting through storms at night from camps barely visible beyond the fog. Then gradually even those memories softened. Because history rarely preserves suspension clearly. It remembers victories, defeats, battles, treaties. But the long quiet waiting afterward often disappears into footnotes despite how deeply it changes the people trapped inside it. You look now across the hillside where evening wind moves through grass tall enough to conceal almost every remaining trace of the camp. The roads remain faintly visible only if you already know where to search. Beyond them, trains cross the valley carrying strangers toward destinations assumed permanent for now. The world continues moving. It always does eventually. Yet somewhere inside the movement of every rebuilt society exist people who spent too long standing still after history finished breaking around them. Men and women who returned physically before arriving emotionally. People who learned during long winters of suspension that survival sometimes means enduring not only danger, but delay. And perhaps that is why the valley feels so quiet now beneath the fading light. Not because nothing happened here, but because what happened unfolded slowly enough to resemble weather more than war. The stranded army waited. The seasons turned. The roads reopened. And one by one, the soldiers disappeared into other lives carrying invisible winters within them long after the snow itself was gone. You've been part of Echoes of War, where stories rise on quiet wings, and the past still circles above us, refusing to land.